The message came through at 11:47 p.m. 4 words that cracked something open in a man who hadn't felt anything crack in years. Promised me. St. Vincent's. No name. No explanation. Just that and a phone number he'd buried so deep in a drawer 3 years ago that finding it again had felt like digging up a grave. Damien Cross read it twice. Then he put his phone face down on his desk, poured 2 fingers of whiskey, and didn't drink it. He stood there for 41 seconds. His security chief, Renzo, watched him from the doorway and said nothing. Because men like Renzo learned early that the most dangerous version of Damien Cross wasn't the one who shouted. It was the one who went very, very still. Then Damien picked up his coat and walked out into the rain. He didn't explain where he was going. He didn't take his full security detail. He took Renzo and 1 car, and he drove towards St. Vincent's Memorial Hospital like a man who had decided something, though even he couldn't have said exactly what. Whatever it wasn't mercy. Right now somewhere across this city, or maybe across the world, you're watching this story unfold. And something in you already knows this isn't just about a mafia boss and a hospital. It's about a promise made in the dark that didn't survive the morning. It's about what happens when a powerful man realizes, too late, that the one person he destroyed was the only one who ever told him the truth. If this were you, if you had made that promise, and broken it, and then gotten that message, what would you do? Stay with us. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story that gets under your skin. And drop a comment below. Tell us the city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels, because it's just getting started. The rain had been falling since 8 o'clock. The kind of rain that didn't come down so much as hang in the air, thick and cold and relentless. The kind that soaked through a coat before a man even reached his car door. Damien didn't notice it. He sat in the back of the black SUV with his jaw set and his eyes fixed on nothing. And the only sound was the wiper blades cutting back and forth across the windshield like a metronome, counting down to something neither man in the car wanted to name. Renzo drove. He knew better than to ask questions when Damien looked like this, like something had been lit inside him, and he was deciding whether to let it burn or smother it with his bare hands. In 12 years of working for Damien Cross, Renzo had seen him do both. Neither outcome was pleasant for whoever happened to be in the room. You know what hospital she's at? Renzo asked, finally, because the silence had stretched past the point of professionalism. I said St. Vincent's. I heard you say St. Vincent's. I'm asking if you know why she's there. Damien turned his head slowly and looked at Renzo in a way that ended the conversation. St. Vincent's Memorial was 22 minutes from the Cross estate on a dry night. Renzo made it in 15. He pulled up to the emergency bay, and Damien was out of the car before it fully stopped, moving through the automatic doors like a man who had never once in his life considered that a room might not want him in it. The ER waiting area smelled like floor cleaner and old coffee, and the particular kind of despair that settles into places where people sit and wait for news they're not ready for. A row of plastic chairs, half of them occupied. A television mounted high on the wall, muted, showing weather coverage. A woman in scrubs behind a reception desk who looked up when Damien came through the doors and immediately clocked that this was not a man who had come here because he was sick. He was tall 6'2", broad through the shoulders, the kind of build that came from the particular physics of a man who had spent decades making other men uncomfortable just by existing in the same space. His coat was soaked through. His expression was the kind of controlled fury that could be mistaken at a distance for calm. "Elena Marlowe," he said. "She was brought in tonight." "Where is she?" The woman behind the desk blinked. "Are you family?" "Yes." "Can I get your... Where is she?" It wasn't a question the second time. The woman picked up her phone, said something quietly, listened, and then looked back at him with the careful expression of someone deciding how much trouble they wanted. "She's in labor and delivery," the woman said. "Floor. But I need to..." He was already moving toward the elevator. Renzo caught up to him at the doors, pressed the button, and said nothing. The elevator smelled like antiseptic and something else, something metallic and close. Damien stood with his hands clasped in front of him and stared at the floor display. Labor and delivery. He turned the phrase over in his mind and felt something cold move through him, something that had nothing to do with the rain still soaking into his collar. Elena had been gone for 3 years. She had disappeared so completely that his best people men, who could find a ghost with the right resources, had found nothing for 6 months. And then what they'd found hadn't been enough to act on. A name on a lease in a city 2 states over. A phone registered to someone else. The kind of trail a woman leaves when she's learned not to leave trails. He had told himself she left because she was guilty, that she ran because running was what guilty people did. He had told himself that so many times over 3 years that it had stopped feeling like a story he was telling himself and started feeling like fact. Labor and delivery. The elevator doors opened. The 4th floor was quieter than the ER and softer in a way that felt almost cruel in contrast muted colors. Lower lights, a different kind of waiting than the one downstairs. A nurse's station to the left. A long corridor to the right, lined with doors. A nurse came toward him immediately, younger than the woman downstairs, and more alarmed. "Sir, visiting hours Elena Marlowe," he said. "Which room?" "Sir, I can't— Which room?" she faltered. Behind her, another nurse was already reaching for a phone. Damien looked past them both, down the corridor, and that was when he saw it through the narrow rectangular window set into one of the doors at the far end of the hall. Through the glass, the light inside the room, warmer than the fluorescent light in the corridor. He could see a bed. He could see the shapes of 2 figures in scrubs, moving with the focused particular urgency of people in the middle of something that required everything they had. And he could see, in the center of all of it, a woman. She was pale, not the pale of someone who hadn't slept enough, but the pale of someone being wrung out from the inside, color stripped away by something her body was being put through, whether she consented to it or not. Her hair was dark and damp and pushed back from her face. Her hands gripped the rails of the hospital bed like she was holding herself to the earth by force. She was alone, no family beside her, no hand to hold. Nothing but the 2 nurses working around her, and the particular devastating solitude of a woman doing something enormous without anyone who loved her in the room. And Cross, who had not faltered in front of another human being in 15 years, who had sat across tables from men who wanted him dead and eaten his dinner without trembling, stopped walking. He stood in the middle of that corridor and looked through that window. And something happened to his face that Renzo, standing 6 feet behind him, had never seen happen to it before. It wasn't grief exactly. It wasn't guilt, not yet, not cleanly. It was something more primitive than either of those things. The look of a man who has just understood, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, that something he believed was true is not true, and that the distance between what he believed and what is real is going to cost him in a way he cannot yet calculate. Stood there for a long moment. Then he said quietly, to no one in particular, "How long has she been in there?" The nurse who'd been about to call security stopped. She looked at his face, and something in what she saw made her reconsider. "Almost 6 hours," she said after a moment. 6 hours. Alone. He didn't go in. Not right away. He stood in that corridor for a long time. Long enough that Renzo eventually found a chair and sat in it without being asked, and the nurses eventually stopped hovering and went back to their station. Watching him with the wary patience of people who had decided he wasn't going to be a problem, but weren't fully convinced yet. Damien watched Elena through the window. He watched her face when the contractions came the way her jaw locked, and her eyes went somewhere far away, somewhere inside herself, like she was going to the only quiet place she could find, and holding on to it until the wave passed. He watched her breathe through it, ragged and controlled at the same time, the nurses talking to her in low voices, one of them adjusting something, the other checking readings on the monitor beside the bed. He watched her come back from those waves, face slack with exhaustion, and then tighten again as the next one built. She hadn't looked toward the door. She didn't know he was there. 3 years, he thought. 3 years of telling himself she was the one who destroyed things. 3 years of building a version of the story in which she was the villain. Because if she wasn't the villain, then he was, and that was a version of the story he hadn't been able to live inside. He'd gotten the initial accusation from a man he trusted. Marcus Vane, his head of intelligence, 15 years in Damien's organization, the kind of loyalties you stopped questioning because it had been tested enough times to seem permanent. Marcus had come to him with evidence, documents, timestamps, communication logs that showed someone inside Damien's inner circle had been feeding information to a federal task force for months. Someone with access to the financial structure, the shell companies, the routing accounts that kept Damien's operation insulated from scrutiny. The access logs pointed to Elena. He'd confronted her at midnight in the study of their house. He'd put the documents on the desk between them and watched her face, and what he'd seen there, the shock, the fear, the tears that came fast and hard, he'd read as guilt. He'd read everything she did in that room as guilt, Because Marcus was standing in the doorway, and Marcus was certain, and Damien had been tired and furious and afraid, in a way he'd never once admitted to himself. Because the thing beneath the rage was the thing he couldn't look at directly, the possibility that the only person he'd ever fully trusted had turned on him. He'd been wrong about which person that was. He understood that now. He didn't have proof yet that would come later, over weeks he couldn't yet see, through a chain of confrontations he hadn't had. But standing in this corridor, watching the woman he had thrown out of his life, giving birth alone, 6 hours, no one sat beside her. He understood something had gone wrong, in a way that had nothing to do with Elena Marlowe. The sound came through the door as a muffled voice sharpening, one of the nurses saying something urgent. Damien straightened. Through the window, he could see the activity in the room changing tempo, the particular controlled rush of people who have been waiting for something. And it is now here. His hand was on the door handle before he consciously decided to move. The nurse at the station was on her feet. "Sir, you can't." He pushed through. The room smelled like antiseptic and exertion, and something rawer beneath it, the smell of a body working past its limits. One of the nurses turned toward him with an expression that was half alarm and half the pragmatic fury of someone who did not have time for this, and started to say something. And then he said, "I'm her husband." The words came out wrong. He heard it the moment they left his mouth, not what he meant to say, or maybe exactly what he meant to say in a way that had nothing to do with legal accuracy and everything to do with something else he wasn't ready to name. Elena heard him. She turned her head on the pillow and looked at him across the room, and her face did something complicated shock first, then something hard closing over it, then something else beneath the hard thing, something that looked, for just a second, like relief she was furious at herself for feeling. "Get out," she said. Her voice was hoarse. It shook with exhaustion, not with fear. He knew the difference. "Elena, I'm kind of in the middle of something, Damien." "I know." "Then get out." He didn't get out. He stood inside the door, hands at his sides, and looked at her, and she looked back at him. And neither of them said anything for a few seconds while the nurses looked between them with the expressions of people who had not signed up for this particular theatrical event tonight. Then another contraction hit, and Elena's face went tight and inward, and she stopped looking at him because she had more important things to do than look at him. And Damien, without thinking, without deciding, without the kind of careful calculus he'd applied to every significant action of his adult life, crossed the room and stood beside her bed. "What are you doing?" she said through her teeth, eyes closed, hands white on the rail. "I don't know," he said, which was the most honest thing he'd said to another human being in years. Comforting. "Elena, don't talk to me right now." A pause, the contraction cresting. Her knuckles went whiter. "Don't talk to me right now, and don't you dare leave." He didn't leave. He stood beside the bed, and he didn't touch her, because she hadn't asked him to, and he had no right to, and there were 1,000 reasons he should have left, and exactly one reason he didn't, which was the same reason he'd driven through a rainstorm at midnight to get here in the first place. He had made a promise once. He had broken it, and somewhere in the small, locked room at the center of him, where he kept the things he couldn't afford to look at directly. He had known that for 3 years. The delivery took 40 minutes more from the moment he walked in. He stayed at the edge of the room, mostly, back against the wall, watching the nurses and the doctor work, watching Elena's face cycle through expressions he had never seen on her before. Not because she hadn't felt things like this before, but because in the years they'd been together, she'd always had walls up. The same way he did. The same way people who've been hurt learn to build them. He'd thought he knew her. He'd thought he knew what she looked like when she was at the limit of what she could manage. He had not known she was extraordinary. Not in a way that was beautiful or cinematic. She was pale and sweating and shaking, and she swore once sharply in a voice that would have surprised anyone who knew the careful, composed version of Elena Marlowe she showed the world. She was extraordinary in the way that a person is extraordinary when you watch them do something very hard without looking away from it, without pretending it isn't hard, without performing anything at all. He watched her, and he thought about the night he had put those documents on the desk between them. He thought about the way she'd said his name, Damien, not like an accusation or a plea, but like a question, like she genuinely couldn't understand what she was looking at. He'd read it as performance. He'd been so certain. The doctor said something. One of the nurses responded. The activity in the room reached a particular peak that Damien recognized as the precipice of something, and then a sound cut through the room that was unlike anything else. small and enormous at the same time, furious and clear. Damien's lungs stopped working for a second. The baby was red-faced and outraged and real in a way that the last 4 months of receiving second-hand information about Elena's existence had made the idea of this baby difficult to be. He'd known intellectually what the message likely meant when he received it. He'd spent the drive over dismantling his certainty about that, rebuilding it, dismantling it again. This was not intellectual. This was a sound that reached into the part of him that had nothing to do with power or calculation or the careful architecture of his daily life, and did something there he didn't have language for. "It's a girl," one of the nurses said. He heard Elena exhale. It was the sound of someone putting down something very heavy they had been carrying for a very long time. He looked at her face. She was crying. She didn't try to stop it, didn't wipe her eyes or turn away. She just lay there with her face open, in a way he had not seen it in 3 years, and watched the nurses wrap her daughter in a white blanket with efficiency and care, and her arms came up when the bundle was placed in them, with a certainty that had nothing to do with learning, and everything to do with the particular instinct of a body, recognizing what it belongs to. She held her daughter. She looked at her daughter's face. And then, after a moment, she looked up at Damien. He didn't know what was on his face. He'd stopped managing it somewhere in the last 40 minutes and hadn't found the energy to pick that up again. Whatever it was, Elena looked at it, and something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly. Not yet. Not close to yet, because there was too much between them for anything to soften quickly, but something changed, like a calculation revised. "She has your hands," Elena said. Her voice was still rough, still hoarse. "Already. Look at her hands." He looked. He stepped closer without meaning to, close enough to see the tiny, clenched fists in the edge of the blanket, the fingers impossibly small and impossibly complete. His throat felt strange, tight in a way he wasn't accustomed to managing. "She needs a name," he said. It was not what he'd meant to say. He wasn't sure what he'd meant to say. "I know." Elena looked back down at her daughter. "I've been thinking about it for 8 months. What did you decide?" A long pause. The nurses were moving quietly around them now, doing the necessary things in the careful way people do when they can see that 2 other people are in the middle of something that doesn't include them. "Nora," Elena said. "Nora Cross." He heard his name in it. She hadn't taken it away from the child. Despite everything, despite 3 years, and whatever she'd been through in 3 years, and however much reason she had to cut him out completely, she had kept his name in her daughter's name. He sat down in the chair beside the bed, because his legs seemed to have decided they were done since standing. "Elena," he said. Not tonight." Her voice was steady. Tired, steady. "Whatever you need to say, whatever you think you understand right now, not tonight. Tonight I have my daughter, and I have exactly nothing left for anything else. Do you understand?" He understood. "Yes." "Then sit there and be quiet." He sat there and was quiet. The rain kept falling outside the window, the sound of it soft against the glass. Somewhere in the hospital, a phone rang and was answered. The monitor beside Elena's bed beeped its steady, unremarkable rhythm. Nora Cross, 8 pounds and 2 ounces and furious at the world, slept in her mother's arms with the absolute certainty of someone who didn't know yet that the world was the kind of place that could disappoint you. Damien sat in the chair and looked at the 2 of them, and somewhere in him, in that small locked room he'd never let anyone near, something shifted on its foundation. Not broke, not opened, just moved, the way something moves when the pressure outside it finally changes. He hadn't thought about the message you promised me since he'd walked into this room. Thought about it now. He turned it over. Who had sent it? Elena's phone. But was it Elena who sent it? She hadn't seemed surprised to see him, but she hadn't seemed like she'd been waiting for him either. She'd told him to get out. She'd told him not to leave. He turned that over too. It was close to 2 in the morning when the door opened again, and the man who walked up through it was not hospital staff. He was in his early 30s, with Elena's coloring, and none of her composure darker under the eyes, jaw tight. A look on his face that was equal parts relief and fury, and something that had been wrung through fear for long enough to leave a residue. Stopped when he saw Damien. The 2 men looked at each other across the room. Elena, half asleep, opened her eyes. "Vincent," she said. "I got here as fast as I could." Her brother didn't look away from Damien. "I didn't know you'd have company." "He showed up. I can see that." Vincent Marlowe's jaw worked. His hands were doing something at his sides, opening and closing, the unconscious motion of a man deciding something about whether to use them. "Why is he here, Elle?" "I'm not entirely sure," Elena said. Her voice was thicker now with exhaustion. He hasn't explained himself. I'd like to hear the explanation, Vincent said. He said it directly at Damien. Damien looked at him. He thought about the message again. The 4 words, the phone number he'd buried in a drawer. Alina's phone, but Alina looked like she hadn't sent a message to anyone in the last 10 hours, because Alina had been busy doing something that used everything she had. You sent me that message, Damien said. It wasn't a question. Vincent didn't pretend it was. She wouldn't, Vincent said. She'd rather have delivered that baby on the sidewalk than ask you for anything. But he stopped. The fury on his face did something complicated. But you made her a promise 3 years ago. And there are things you need to know, and she wouldn't tell you, so I decided to. Elena's eyes were open, fully now. She was watching her brother with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and something sharper, not anger, but the look of a woman who has been making decisions for 3 years and is watching someone else make one on her behalf. Vincent, she said. He needs to know, Elle. Not tonight. Tonight. Vincent's voice didn't waver. Because tomorrow might be too late. The room went still. Damien looked between the two of them. He felt something changing in the air, the particular atmospheric shift of a conversation that is about to leave the territory of the personal and move somewhere more dangerous. What does that mean? He said. Vincent pulled a chair to the other side of Elena's bed. He sat in it. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and he looked at Damien with the measured, careful look of a man who has rehearsed something important and is deciding whether the version he rehearsed is still the right one. Marcus Vane, Vincent said. Damien went very still. What about Marcus Vane? He set her up. Vincent said it flatly, without drama, without the performance of someone delivering a revelation. He said it the way you say something, when you've lived with it, for long enough that it doesn't need decoration. The evidence you found, the access logs, the documents, he built all of it. He needed someone to take the blame, and your wife was the cleanest option. She had access because you trusted her. She couldn't defend herself without going to you, and he'd already controlled what you saw. Damien said nothing. She didn't run because she was guilty, Vincent said. She ran because she was pregnant, and she'd just been thrown out of her home by a man who thought she was a traitor. And 2 days after she left, 2 of Marcus's people showed up at the apartment she was staying at, and she barely got out. Elena had closed her eyes again. Whether she was asleep or simply finished with the conversation, Damien couldn't tell. She couldn't come to you, Vincent said. She tried once, 6 weeks after she left. She sent you a message through an intermediary, and you sent it back unopened. Damien remembered that. He remembered the message. He hadn't opened it, hadn't asked what was in it, had returned it as a statement. He hadn't been in a place, 6 weeks after Elena left, where he was capable of receiving anything from her that wasn't on his own terms. He sat with that. Marcus is still in your organization, Vincent said. He's been there this whole time. And tonight, he paused. His hands, resting on his knees, tightened. Tonight, someone inside Saint. Vincent's filed a patient intake report that went to the wrong place. I don't know if it was accident or not. But 3 hours ago, a car I didn't recognize made 2 slow passes around this block. The temperature in Damien's chest dropped 10 degrees. He looked at Renzo, who was in the corridor. He could see him through the window in the door, sitting in his chair, and as Damien watched, Renzo's head came up, like a man who had just felt a change in the weather. Damien was on his feet. Stay with her, he said to Vincent. Then, to Elena's brother who was already watching him, with the complicated expression of a man who hates someone and needs them at the same time, no one comes in this room that isn't hospital staff. You understand me? Vincent held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. Damien went through the door, and his phone was already in his hand, and the night, which had already been several things he wasn't prepared for, was about to become something else entirely. Outside the window at the end of the corridor, through the dark and the rain, the city looked the same as it always did. Wet and lit and indifferent. Damien Cross looked at it the way he looked at every room he walked into, like a man calculating the exits. But something was different now, in the way he calculated. Something had been added to the equation in the last 2 hours that he hadn't had in it before. He had a daughter. Her name was Nora, and she slept in her mother's arms, and she had his hands. He wasn't going to let anyone come near either of them. Not tonight. Not ever again. He called his head of security. The phone rang once and was answered. I need every man available at St. Vincent's Memorial, he said. Right now. And I need you to find Marcus Vane. Pause on the other end of the line. Find him tonight, Damien said. And don't let him know you're looking. He hung up. He stood at the end of the corridor in a hospital that smelled like antiseptic and new life, with rain coming down on the other side of the glass, and he felt something settle into him, not calm, exactly, but clarity. Particular sharpening that happened when the thing you were supposed to be protecting finally had a face. Down the hall, behind a closed door, Nora Cross slept through the beginning of the worst night of her father's professional life and the first night of the rest of it. She didn't know yet, she couldn't, but her father knew. And Damien Cross, who had built an empire on the willingness to do whatever was necessary, had just decided what necessary meant. Renzo was already on his feet when Damien came through the door. He didn't need to be told something had changed. 12 years of working beside Damien Cross had given Renzo the particular sensitivity of a man who has learned to read weather before it arrives, the way the air thickened, the way Damien's shoulders set differently when the threat was real versus when it was manageable. Right now the shoulders said real. 2 cars, Renzo said, before Damien could speak. I clocked them from the window at the end of the hall. Black sedans, no plates I could read. They made a pass 8 minutes ago, and I've been watching since. How many men do we have in the building? 2 downstairs. 1 at the parking structure. That's not enough. No, Renzo agreed. It's not. Damien was already typing on his phone. He sent 3 messages in rapid succession, short, direct, the kind of communication that didn't require a response, only compliance. Then he put the phone in his coat pocket and looked at the door to Elena's room. Nobody goes in or out of that room without my approval, he said. Vincent Marlowe is in there. He stays. You trust him? Damien thought about Vincent's face when he'd said Marcus Vane's name, the flatness of it, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a truth for too long and finally put it down in front of the wrong person for the right reasons. He sent me the message tonight, Damien said. He could have not done that. Renzo nodded. That was enough. I'm going downstairs, Damien said. I want to see who's outside. That's not... I know. He moved toward the elevator. Come on. The lobby of St. Vincent's Memorial at 2:15 in the morning was sparse a security guard at the main desk, who looked up when they came out of the elevator. 2 people in the plastic chairs near the far wall, a janitor running a mop across the floor near the entrance. The overhead lights were the particular quality of institutional lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. Damien walked to the main doors and looked through the glass. The rain had thinned since midnight, dropping to the kind of fine mist that the windshield wipers struggle with. The ambulance bay was empty. The drop-off circle in front of the entrance had 2 cars in it, a minivan, engine off, a family presumably inside somewhere, dealing with something terrible and ordinary. A Honda with a cracked rear light. Down the block, at the edge of the street lamp's reach, a dark sedan sat with its engine running. He could see the exhaust rising in the cold air. He watched it. Didn't move. Renzo came beside him and looked in the same direction. There's another one, Renzo said quietly. Other side of the block. I can see the headlights from here. 2 cars. Sitting. Waiting. The thing about men who came to do violence professionally, the thing that distinguished them from the kind of desperate, improvised danger Damien had spent 20 years navigating, was that they were patient. They didn't rush. They waited for the geometry of the situation to arrange itself favorably, and then they moved. These men were waiting. They're not coming in, Damien said. Not yet. They want her outside. He turned it over. A hospital was a complicated environment. For this kind of work, cameras, staff, civilian witnesses, a security desk. Whatever Marcus had authorized, it wasn't a frontal assault on a maternity ward. They want to wait until she's discharged, or until I bring her out. Then we don't bring her out. We can't stay here indefinitely, Renzo. No, Renzo said. But our people will be here in 20 minutes. We can hold a hospital for 20 minutes. Damien looked at the sedan down the block, looked at it long enough that whoever was sitting in it would know they'd been seen if they were watching. He wanted them to know. He wanted them to understand that the geometry of this situation had just changed. He pulled out his phone again and called a number that rang twice before being answered. I need the surveillance footage from the last 4 hours around St. Vincent's Memorial, he said. Every camera within 2 blocks. Tonight he listened. I don't care what it takes. 2 hours. He hung up. The security guard at the desk was watching them now, with the expression of a man who understood that something was happening in his lobby, that his training had not prepared him for. Damien looked at him. Call your supervisor, Damien said. Tell him you need additional staff on all entrances tonight. Tell him it's a security concern, and you want the doors monitored. Can you do that? The guard blinked. Yes, sir. Good. He turned back toward the elevator. Vincent was standing when Damien came back into the room. Elena was asleep, genuinely asleep now, the particular heaviness of someone whose body has simply refused to negotiate further. Nora was in the bassinet beside the bed, wrapped tight in her white blanket, face slack and perfect and oblivious. Vincent looked at Damien from across the room. He had his arms crossed over his chest in a way that wasn't aggression exactly, but was the posture of someone who had not decided yet whether to be an ally or an obstacle. "There are people outside," Damien said quietly. He kept his voice down, though Elena wouldn't have woken for anything short of Nora crying. Vincent's face didn't change the way a face changes when someone hears surprising news. It changed the way it changes when someone hears the thing they've been afraid of confirmed. "How many?" he said. "2 cars that I can see. More I can't." Damien moved to the window, looked down at the street below. From the 4th floor, the angle was different. He could see the roof of the dark sedan, could see it hadn't moved. "Tell me what you know about Marcus Vane's operation." "Not the history. Right now, tonight, who is he using?" Vincent unfolded his arms. He pulled the chair he'd been sitting in earlier around and sat in it, leaning forward in the same posture as before, elbows on knees, hands clasped, the body language of a man who needs to think while he talks. "I've been trying to track him for 2 years, Vincent said. I don't have your resources. I'm a contractor. I do systems work. But I know people, and over 2 years I pulled threads where I could." He looked at the floor for a moment. 4 men he uses for the kind of work that can't go on any record. Not your people outside contractors. 2 of them I have names for. Brennan and a man who goes by Colt, which is not his real name. "Brennan," Damien said. He said it to himself, tasting it. "Danny Brennan." Vincent looked up. "You know him. I fired him. 14 months ago. He was running side work I hadn't authorized." He paused. "Marcus recommended him originally. 6 years ago." The 2 men sat with that for a moment. "It's been longer than 3 years, Vincent said. "Whatever Marcus built inside your organization, it didn't start when Elena left. Started before." Damien knew that. On some level, sitting in the chair beside Elena's bed earlier, watching her face, letting the math of the last 3 years rearrange itself, he had already started to understand the shape of it, places where his judgment had failed. The times he'd taken Marcus's, read on a situation without running his own check, because Marcus had been there for 15 years, and 15 years felt like bedrock. Bedrock could be hollow. He knew that. He'd known it about other people's foundations. He'd just never applied it to his own. "How did you find out?" Damien said. "About the frame." Vincent's jaw tightened. He looked at his clasped hands. "She called me," he said. "The night you threw her out. 3 in the morning. She called me. And she wasn't hysterical. Elena doesn't do hysterical. But she was." He stopped. Started again. "She was in pieces. She told me what happened. And she told me what you'd shown her. And I didn't believe her at first. I'm not proud of that. You'd been in my life for 4 years by then, and I thought I understood what kind of man you were. And the evidence sounded solid. And I thought," he exhaled hard, "I thought maybe she'd gotten in over her head somehow. That maybe she'd done something without understanding what it would cost. But Elena doesn't do things without understanding what they cost." Vincent looked up. "That's not who she is." "So 2 weeks later, when I'd had time to sit with it, I went back and started asking questions. Not to you. To people on the edges of your organization who didn't have a reason to manage what I heard." He paused. "Took 8 months. And what I found wasn't a paper trail. Marcus is too careful for that. It was a pattern. The way certain information had moved. The way Elena's access had been used in a specific 6-week window when she'd been with me, out of the city, for 3 weeks of it." Damien went still. 3 weeks out of the city," he said. "Her mother was sick. She came to stay with me. She was gone from your house for 22 days. Vincent's voice was level, controlled, carrying the weight of someone who has assembled something ugly and can only report its dimensions. "The access logs Marcus showed you, they're dated within that window. But she wasn't there, Damien. She was with me. I have hotel records. I have her credit card statements. I have photographs from my mother's hospital room with Elena in them, with stamps." The room was very quiet. "You've had this for 2 years, Damien said. "I've had it for 2 years. Why didn't you come to me?" Vincent looked at him with an expression that was patient and furious at the same time. The expression of a man explaining something obvious to someone who should already understand it. "Because the last time Elena trusted you with something real," Vincent said, You handed it back to her in pieces. And I wasn't going to let her be in the room for round 2. The words landed without drama. Damien didn't flinch away from them. He sat with them, the way you sit with something that is true and accurate and that you deserve to hear, the way you sit with a verdict. She didn't know you were coming tonight, Damien said. No. She didn't ask you to contact me. She would rather. Vincent stopped. She has a lot of pride, my sister. And she spent 3 years building a life that didn't include you in it. And she did a good job. And she wasn't going to be the one to come back asking for anything. But she's been running for 8 months, Damien. She moves every 3 to 4 months. She doesn't use her real name when she can avoid it. She's been doing it alone. His voice didn't break, but it came close. Tonight she was in a hospital bed for 6 hours without anyone beside her, and I was 4 hours away because I didn't know it was happening. And he stopped again, and you made her a promise. She told me about the promise. She told me once, and she never mentioned it again, but I remembered it, and I thought if there was ever a night that promise meant anything, it was tonight. Damien looked at the bassinet, at the small shape inside it. Nora's fist had escaped the blanket and rested near her cheek, curled and barely larger than a walnut. He thought about the promise. He had made it 3 weeks after their wedding, in the kitchen of the house they'd just moved into, at 7 in the morning over bad coffee. Elena had been reading the news on her tablet, and she'd looked up and said, without preamble, the way she said things when she'd been thinking about them for a while, if this world you live in ever comes for me, I need to know you'll choose me over it, not instead of it. Can you do that? He had said yes. He had meant it. He had meant it the way you mean things, before you understand what meaning them will actually cost. I remember the promise, Damien said. Vincent looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked away, toward the window at the rain. Then do something about it, he said, because those cars outside aren't going to wait forever. The first of Damien's men arrived 17 minutes later, 4 of them, coming in through the parking structure entrance in plain clothes, nothing visible on them, moving through the hospital the way trained men move through a space when they're trying to look like they're not. Renzo met them at the stairwell and brought them up. Damien laid it out in 60 seconds. 2 men on Elena's floor, 1 outside her room, 1 at the stairwell exit, 1 man down at the main entrance lobby, 1 with Renzo covering the parking structure. Positions only no engagement unless something came through a door that shouldn't. The men nodded and dispersed. It was a holding pattern. Damien knew it. The cars outside were still there. He'd had Renzo check twice, and he had no way of knowing how many more he couldn't see, what the timeline was, whether whoever Marcus had tonight was patient enough to wait until morning, or whether something would shift before then. He needed to talk to Marcus. He stood in the corridor outside Elena's room and turned that over. Calculation of it. He had been operating since midnight on the assumption that Marcus didn't know. Damien knew that whatever Vincent had told him had changed the board. Without Marcus realizing, the board had changed. If Marcus still thought he had Damien's trust, that was leverage. That was the only leverage Damien had right now. That wasn't just firepower and geography. Pulled up Marcus's number. The phone rang 4 times. Then Marcus Vane's voice, slightly rough with sleep, came through. Damien. A pause just long enough to be natural, just short enough to not be suspicious. The pause of a man who'd been woken up and was orienting himself. It's 2:30. I'm at St. Vincent's Memorial, Damien said. Elena's here. She just had a baby. Silence. 3 seconds of silence, which was 2 seconds too many for genuine surprise. I didn't know she was back in the city, Marcus said. Neither did I. Damien kept his voice level, flat. The voice he used when he was giving nothing. I got a message tonight. Came out to see what was going on. He paused. Turns out I have a daughter. Jesus. Marcus's exhale was convincing. Damien had worked with him for 15 years. He knew every register of the man's voice, the way he'd thought, and Marcus's exhale right now was the best piece of performance Damien had heard in years. Controlled and warm, and carrying the exact weight of a man, blindsided by something significant. Are they okay? They're fine. Damien watched the door to Elena's room. She's sleeping, baby's healthy. He let a beat pass. I wanted to let you know. Given the history, of course. Another small pause. How are you holding up? Honestly, I don't know yet. He let something into his voice, not vulnerability. But the surface of it, the texture, enough to be convincing. It's a lot to process. You need anything tonight? I can have people there. I've got Renzo, Damien said. We're fine. I'll check in tomorrow. Okay. Marcus's voice settled into something paternal and steady, The voice he'd always used when Damien was navigating something difficult. The voice Damien had spent 15 years finding reliable. Get some rest when you can. We'll talk in the morning. Yeah, Damien said. Sleep well, Marcus. He hung up. He stood in the corridor and looked at the phone in his hand. Felt the particular cold quality of a truth that had been abstract and was now concrete, the shift from knowing something intellectually and knowing it in the body. Marcus Vane, who had sat across from him for 15 years, who had attended his wedding, who had been in the room when Damien made decisions that couldn't be unmade. Marcus had built the evidence that destroyed his marriage, and had been sitting inside his organization ever since, and had people outside this hospital right now. And he just performed concern in real time, with the fluency of someone who'd been practicing. Damien put his phone away. His hands were steady. They were always steady. It was the one thing about himself he'd never had to work at the body's refusal to betray him in moments of crisis. Whatever was happening inside his chest right now, whatever the name of it was, his hands were not going to be the place it showed. He went back into Elena's room. She was still asleep. Vincent was in his chair, eyes open, watching the door. He looked at Damien when he came in with a question on his face that he didn't speak aloud. Called him, Damien said quietly. Vincent's expression shifted. Why? Because he doesn't know I know. And right now, that's the only advantage I have. He moved to the window, looked down at the street. The sedan was still there. He'll call whoever is in those cars in the next 10 minutes and tell them the situation has changed. That I'm here, that I have security, that the play for tonight needs to be reconsidered. And if he doesn't, then we'll know his timetable is shorter than I think, and we adjust. He looked at Nora's bassinet, but he'll call. Marcus is careful. He's always been careful. It's why it took this long to see him clearly. Vincent was quiet for a moment. Then what happens after tonight? Damien didn't answer immediately. He looked at Elena's face, the way sleep had smoothed it, the way exhaustion and something else, something that might have been relief at being somewhere with walls and locked doors, for the first time in however long, had settled into the lines of her. 3 years. He had cost her 3 years. I need the documentation you have, Damien said. The hotel records. The photographs. Everything. I can get it to you by morning. I also need you to think carefully about anyone else who knew. Anyone Elena told. Anyone who might have been watching her, in contact with her. Anyone who could be a connection that Marcus might know about. Vincent's expression went careful. Why? Because Marcus has been managing this for 3 years. He didn't just set up the frame and walk away, he's been maintaining it. Making sure Elena stayed gone, stayed quiet, couldn't get close enough to be heard. He looked at Vincent directly. He knew she was pregnant. He had to know. The people who showed up at her apartment 6 weeks after she left, they weren't there to warn her. They were there to make sure she understood that staying gone was the only option. Vincent's jaw tightened. She told me about that. She never told me what they said. What did she tell you? That they found her. He stopped. That she had to run faster. The room was quiet. She's been running faster for 3 years, Damien said. That ends tonight. That's easy to say, I know. He looked back at the window. The sedan was gone. He'd been right, Marcus had made the call. He felt no satisfaction in being right. It's easy to say, and it's going to be very hard to do. And Elena is going to have things to say about who gets to make decisions about her safety. And she's not wrong about any of it. He paused. But those cars outside were here because of me. Whatever she's running, from the reason it found her tonight in this hospital, is because I walked through those doors. And Marcus's people put the geography together. I brought this here. Yeah, Vincent said without softening it. You did so. Until Marcus is handled, she doesn't get to choose whether she has protection. She can choose everything else. He turned from the window, but not that. Elena's voice came from the bed, rougher than before, the voice of someone who had been awake for the last part of that conversation and had been deciding whether to announce it. Stop talking about me like I'm not in the room, she said. Both men looked at her. She hadn't opened her eyes yet. She lay with her face toward the ceiling, hands loose at her sides on the hospital blanket, with the particular stillness of someone who is running on fumes and choosing very carefully which muscle groups to use. How long have you been awake? Vincent said. Long enough. She did open her eyes then. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then turned her head and looked at Damien. Her gaze was clear, despite the exhaustion focused. Appraising, the look he'd always known from her. The look that saw past what you were presenting to what was actually there. You called Marcus? Yes, that was a risk. Calculated. She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. You haven't changed. Some things, he said. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she looked at the bassinet beside her, and her face changed in the way it had changed in the delivery room, dropping whatever armor had been up, going somewhere direct and unguarded for just a moment, something private in a room that had stopped being private. She slept through all of this, Elena said. She's practical, Damien said. She inherited that. Elena looked at him again. He wasn't sure what he'd meant by it. The words had come out before he'd selected them, the kind of thing that happens when you stop managing every syllable. She didn't respond to it, which was its own kind of response. What happens now, she said. Not to Vincent, to Damien. Marcus needs to be dealt with before you leave this hospital. I'm working on that. Working on it how? I have the documentation Vincent gathered. I have access logs I can pull from my own systems, now that I know what I'm looking for. I have other resources. He paused. I'm going to build a case tonight that makes it impossible for Marcus to operate. Not just inside my organization. Anywhere. And if he moves first, he won't. He said it with more certainty than he had any right to. He knew it, and she knew it, and she looked at him with the expression of a woman who was choosing to let it stand for now, because she was too exhausted to argue, and because, he suspected, some part of her needed to believe it. Damien, she said. Yeah, if anything happens to her. She stopped. Her throat moved. I need you to understand that she comes first, before the Empire, before the war with Marcus, before whatever score you need to settle. Her eyes held his with the particular, undeniable steadiness of a woman who has been alone with a decision for 8 months and made it completely. She comes first. Do you understand that? He looked at his daughter in the bassinet, the walnut-sized fist. Yes, he said, I understand that. Elena held his gaze for another moment, checking him, the way she'd always been able to, the way that had first unsettled and then unmade him, the particular quality of her attention that made dishonesty feel structurally impossible. Whatever she found, she didn't tell him what it was. She closed her eyes again. Then handle it, she said, and don't wake the baby. It was Renzo's voice through the phone at 3:47 a. That changed everything. Damien was in the corridor. Going through documentation Vincent had uploaded to a shared drive, hotel records, photographs, financial timestamps, slow and careful archaeology of 2 years of an angry and protective brother pulling threads. He had his phone in one hand and a cold cup of coffee he'd gotten from a vending machine down the hall in the other, and he was building the shape of something in his mind, the architecture of Marcus's play, the timeline of it, when Renzo called. We have a problem, Renzo said. The cars came back? No. Different problem. A pause, the specific pause of a man who is choosing his words carefully. My contact at the department just called me. Someone filed a report tonight. An anonymous tip came through a private line, says there's a person of interest at St. Vincent's Memorial connected to an open federal investigation. Another pause. Tip named you specifically. Damien set down the coffee. Marcus, he said. Has to be. The timing is because I called him and told him I was here, and now he's changing the play. He thought fast. If federal agents show up at this hospital tonight, then whatever you're building against Marcus gets complicated, Renzo said. Because you're here, and Elena's here, and they're going to want to talk to both of you. And anything Marcus has already fed them about, Elena is going to be the first thing they're working from. Damien put his back against the wall. This was the move. This was the actual move, not the cars outside. Those were the distraction, the thing meant to make him focus on the physical threat while Marcus worked the other angle. If federal agents arrived here tonight and found Damien Cross at a hospital beside his estranged wife, who had been named in an intelligence leak 3 years ago, Marcus had a second chance to make the narrative stick. He had minutes, maybe less. He pushed off the wall and went back into Elena's room. Wake her up, he said to Vincent. Vincent was on his feet before the words were finished. He knew from Damien's face that this was not a discussion. He touched her shoulder. Elena, you need to wake up. She came awake fast, not groggy, but immediate, the survival instinct of someone who had been waking up fast for 3 years. She was upright before Vincent finished saying her name. She looked at Damien's face, and she understood. How long do we have? She said. I don't know, maybe 20 minutes, maybe less. She was already moving, already reaching for the call buttons beside her bed. I need a nurse. I need to know what the discharge process looks like right now. You were in labor 6 hours ago, Vincent said. I know how long I was in labor, Vincent. She pressed the button. We're not staying here. Damien looked at her, this woman who had spent 3 years running, who had just delivered a child hours ago, who was sitting upright in a hospital bed, in the middle of the night making a logistical decision without blinking, and felt something move in him that he did not have a name for and did not try to find one. Call button light came on. A nurse would come. Where do we go, Vincent said. Safe house, Damien said. I have 3 properties in the city that Marcus has never been given access to. Never been inside, never had the addresses. He looked at Elena. Can you travel? She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and steel. I just pushed a human being into the world, she said. I can get to a car. The nurse came through the door, took one look at the room at the 3 faces, at whatever the atmosphere was doing, and stopped. I need to understand the earliest possible discharge timeline, Elena said to her, before the nurse could speak. And I need to know if there's an exit from this floor that isn't the main lobby. The nurse's mouth opened. She looked at Damien, then back at Elena. There's a service elevator, she said slowly, at the end of the east corridor. Show me, Elena said. Please. The nurse looked at her for another moment. Then she nodded and turned, and they moved, all of them. Damien and Vincent and Elena in a hospital gown, who carried herself like she wasn't in a hospital gown toward whatever came next. Behind them, in the bassinet that a different nurse would move in 60 seconds to a portable crib for transport, Nora Cross slept on, fist curled near her cheek, breathing the slow, even breath of someone who didn't know yet that her life had just become something her parents would have to fight to protect. The point at which there was no going back had been and gone. None of them could say exactly when it had happened. Sometime in the last 4 hours, in the accumulation of small and irreversible things, but it had happened, and they all felt it in the marrow. The particular gravity of a situation that has closed all the doors behind you and left only the one in front. Damien reached the service elevator first and held it open. His eyes met Elena's as she came through with Nora bundled against her chest, wrapped in the hospital blanket, the baby's face invisible against her shoulder. Elena didn't say anything. Neither did he. They stepped into the elevator, and the doors closed, and whatever the next chapter of this was going to cost them, it had already begun. The service elevator smelled like industrial cleaner and old metal, and it moved slowly, the kind of slow that felt deliberate, like the building itself was deciding whether to cooperate. Damien stood with his back to the wall and watched the floor display count down. Elena stood beside him with Nora against her chest, one hand spread across the baby's back, the other gripping the metal rail along the elevator wall. Vincent was on her other side. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the elevator's mechanical complaint and the soft, rhythmic sound of Nora breathing against her mother's shoulder. Renzo was already at the basement level, having taken the stairs. He had the parking structure entrance covered, and a car pulled around to the loading dock. A vehicle that had never been registered to anything connected to Damien's name, kept in a garage 2 miles from the estate for exactly this category of situation. The elevator stopped. The doors opened onto a corridor that was beige and badly lit and smelled like the underside of a hospital, the part that existed to move things and people without anyone having to see it happen. A laundry cart against one wall, a utility door propped open at the far end. Renzo was at the end of the corridor. He looked at Elena, looked at the baby, looked at Damien. Car's 30 feet from the loading dock door, he said. I don't see anyone watching that side, but we move fast. She just had a baby, Renzo. Vincent said, I know that. Renzo looked at Elena again, his expression carrying the particular respect of a man who has updated his read on someone quickly. You tell me when. Elena looked down at Nora. The baby's face was still slack with sleep, mouth slightly open, the absurd and total peace of someone who didn't know there was anything to be afraid of. Elena adjusted her grip, tucked the hospital blanket tighter, and looked up. Now, she said. They moved. The safe house was 40 minutes from the hospital, in a part of the city that was neither affluent enough to draw attention, nor distressed enough to generate it, a residential street of older buildings. Mature trees, kind of neighborhood that had been the same for 30 years and would stay that way for 30 more. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a 4-story building, held under a corporate name that had no visible connection to anything Damien owned, leased through a property management company that handled it at arm's length and asked no questions. Inside, it was clean and functional, and slightly cold a place maintained rather than lived in, with furniture that had been chosen for adequacy rather than comfort and cupboards stocked with the basic and imperishable. Renzo had turned the heat on remotely during the drive over. Elena sat on the couch with Nora in her arms and said nothing for a long time after they arrived. Vincent moved through the apartment checking windows and sight lines, not because he had training for it, but because he needed something to do with his hands. Renzo stood near the door. Damien stood in the center of the main room, with his phone out, going through what had come in while they were moving. 3 messages from his surveillance. Contact the footage from the cameras around St. Vincent's memorial had started coming through. He opened the files and scrolled through them. The grainy timestamp footage of a wet city block at 2 and 3 in the morning, the Dark's sedan, angles and positions. The 4th message was from a number he didn't recognize, and it stopped him. He opened it. Check who signed the intake form. Room 412. Tonight. He read it twice. Then he forwarded it to Renzo and kept moving. He had 4 of his people pulling Marcus's communication records, not the official channels, which Marcus would have kept clean, but the secondary routes that long-term operators used when they needed to talk to people who weren't on their approved contact list. Burner numbers. Routing through cutouts. The kind of infrastructure that took time to build and left traces if you knew exactly where to look. And Damien had people who knew exactly where to look. He also had the documentation. Vincent had assembled the hotel records, the photographs, the financial timestamps uploaded, and being cross-referenced against the access logs from his own systems. He'd pulled those himself, remotely, from a partition of his network that Marcus had administrative access to, but that logged every entry in a secondary record Marcus didn't know existed. Damien had built that secondary log 3 years ago after a different security concern. He'd never had to use it. He was using it now. The shape of what Marcus had done was becoming clearer with each thing that came through. Methodical, patient, built over time with the care of someone who understood that the most durable lies were the ones constructed out of real materials, actual access logs, actual timestamps, actual communication metadata, just attributed to the wrong person and assembled in the wrong sequence. Marcus had not fabricated evidence from nothing. He had taken real data and reframed it, and he had done it well enough that Damien, operating at peak fury and wounded pride, had accepted the frame without testing it. He sat down in the chair across from Elena. She was watching him. Nora had fallen back into her deep, indifferent sleep, and Elena was watching Damien with the particular attention of someone who is waiting to understand something, not someone who is afraid. "Talk to me," she said. "I'm building the case. It's coming together." He paused. "There are things I need to ask you. About the 6 weeks before you left. Specific interactions with Marcus." Elena's expression went careful. Not closed, but careful, the look of a woman deciding how much she trusts the ground before she steps on it. "What do you need?" she said. "He had access to your email. Not because you gave it to him. He would have needed a technical route in." He leaned forward. "Did he ever have access to your devices? Any period when your laptop or your phone was out of your hands for more than a few hours?" Thought about it. He watched her think, watched her go back through something she'd clearly already examined many times, the particular revisiting quality of someone who has replayed a period obsessively, looking for the fault line. Once she said, 4 months before everything, my laptop froze. Marcus offered to have someone in the tech division look at it. I was in the middle of 3 things, and I said yes without thinking about it. She paused. They had it for 2 days. 2 days was plenty. He had a keystroke logger installed, Damien said. Probably a remote access tool underneath that. He would have had everything: passwords, emails, your access credentials for the financial accounts I'd shared with you. He said it flatly, not to hurt her with it, but because the clarity of it mattered more than the tact. He used your credentials to make the access logs look like you. Elena absorbed that. Her face did something tight and controlled, the expression of someone receiving information that confirms something terrible they already suspected, but had hoped was wrong. I should have been more careful, she said. You had no reason to be careful of Marcus Vane, Damien said. I had no reason to think he needed watching. That's on me, not on you. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked down at Nora. People who came to the apartment, she said. 6 weeks after I left. 2 men. She paused. They didn't say anything. They didn't threaten me explicitly. They just stood in the doorway and looked at me, and one of them said, "You should keep moving." That was all. Brennan, Damien said. I didn't know his name. He's one of Marcus's outside contractors. I fired him 14 months ago, but he was still working for Marcus directly. He's the one Marcus uses when he needs something that can't go through the organization. How long have you known that? Since about 2 hours ago. He kept his voice level. Vincent told me. Elena looked at her brother across the room. Vincent had stopped his circuit of the windows and was leaning against the wall near the kitchen doorway, arms crossed again. You knew about Brennan, she said to him. I had a name, Vincent said. I didn't know what to do with it that would actually help you. Could have told me. You would have done something with it. Yes, Elena said. That's the point. You would have done something with it alone. Vincent said, because that's what you do, Elle. You've been handling everything alone for 3 years because you decided the alternative was worse, and I made the call that I wasn't going to hand you another thread to pull by yourself in the dark. The room went quiet with the particular quality of a silence that has a history. We can do this later, Damien said. We cannot do it at all, Elena said. But she looked back down at Nora, and the tension in her shoulders changed, not released, but redirected. Tucked back into the place, she kept things she wasn't finished with. It was Vincent's phone that went off first. He looked at it, and his face changed in a way that brought Damien upright in his chair before Vincent said a word. What? Damien said. Vincent turned the phone around. It was a news alert, a local outlet, the kind of secondary source that picked up court documents and federal press releases before the larger papers got to them. The alert was 4 lines. Federal Task Force confirms ongoing investigation into cross-consolidated holdings and associated entities. Source confirms arrest warrant issued for Damien Cross on charges of racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy. Warrant to be executed imminently. Damien read it twice, and he understood. The anonymous tip to the department hadn't been to bring federal agents to the hospital to complicate the scene. That was what he'd thought, that Marcus was using the federal channel as a disruption, a way to muddy the narrative while Damien was occupied with Elena. That wasn't what it was. Marcus had been feeding the federal task force for months. Not just the framing evidence against Elena, everything. The financial architecture of the empire, the shell companies, the routing accounts. The full structural picture that would let a prosecutor build a case substantial enough to move on. Marcus hadn't flipped recently. Marcus had been working with the federal task force for a long time. Long enough to build something comprehensive. Long enough to become, in the official record, a cooperating witness who was nowhere near the criminal conspiracy he'd been documenting, because the cooperating witness had made sure that the documentation pointed at Elena and at Damien and kept Marcus cleanly outside the frame. The arrest warrant wasn't the result of tonight's tip. Tonight's tip was just the trigger, the signal to move on a warrant that had already been prepared, just waiting for the right moment. And the right moment, Marcus had decided, was the moment when Damien was at a hospital in the middle of the night with no preparation, his security improvised, his attention divided. He's been working with them the whole time, Renzo said from the door. He'd read it over Vincent's shoulder. His voice had the quality of a man revising a significant assumption. The frame on Elena, it wasn't just to protect him inside the organization. It was to give them a secondary target for the investigation. So when he was ready to move, Damien said he could hand them 2 people instead of 1. Elena as the inside source, me as the principal. He looked at the alert on Vincent's phone. The federal case against me is built on evidence Marcus curated. He built it to be airtight. Anything he couldn't sanitize away from himself, he attributed to her or to me. Can you fight it? Vincent said. The documentation I've been pulling tonight. He stopped. He ran the calculation. The access logs, the hotel records, the timestamps that put Elena out of the city during the window of the fabricated evidence. He had started building a case that Marcus had framed Elena. But that case in isolation didn't dismantle what Marcus had fed the federal investigators about the financial architecture. That was real. The shell companies were real. The routing accounts were real. Marcus hadn't needed to fabricate the underlying financial structure, he just needed to document it comprehensively and hand it over. The case against Damien for racketeering and money laundering didn't depend on Elena being guilty of anything. That case was going to hold. He sat with that for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was. Renzo was watching him. Vincent was watching him. Elena was watching him, and she had been listening to all of it, and her face had the expression of a woman doing the same calculation and arriving at the same answer. They're coming here, she said. It wasn't a question. They don't know about this location, Damien said. They don't need to know the address, she said. They have a warrant. They'll put your known people under surveillance. They'll follow the phones. She stopped. How many people know we're here, he thought. 4 of my men. Renzo. You and Vincent, your men's phones, she said. He looked at Renzo. Renzo looked back at him with the expression of a man who has understood the problem half a second before being asked about it. He reached into his coat and pulled out his phone, turned it over in his hand, thinking about the last 4 hours, the calls made, the locations, the digital trail of a man doing his job through a difficult night. I used my regular phone, Renzo said. I know, Damien said. I always use my regular phone. You've never... I know, he hadn't in 12 years asked Renzo to operate on burners and clean phones because the level of operational security that required had never been necessary for Renzo's role. Bruns managed security, not the kind of sensitive communications that needed to be compartmentalized. It had never been a problem. It was a problem now. How long do we have? Vincent said. Damien looked at the timestamp on the news alert. 4:23 a.m. If the warrant had been ready and Marcus had triggered it tonight, the task force would have been mobilizing since roughly the time of the tip, call it 3:30. They would go to the estate first, then his known properties. Then they'd start working outward through known associates, and when Renzo's phone location data led them in this direction, they'd work the neighborhood. 2 hours, he said. Maybe 3, he stood up. He was already moving through the architecture of the problem, the thing his mind did under pressure, not panic. Never panic, but the cold and rapid sorting of variables into what could be controlled and what couldn't. What couldn't be controlled? The federal warrant. The financial case that Marcus had built. Criminal architecture of his empire, which was real and substantial and documented, could be controlled, where Elena and Nora were. The documentation he had about Marcus's role. The specific question of whether Marcus's status as a cooperating witness survived the evidence that he had fabricated the case against Elena. Because if a key witness for the federal prosecution had manufactured evidence and framed an innocent person, the prosecution had a problem that went beyond Damien Cross. He looked at Elena. I need a lawyer, he said. Specifically, I need Holt. Carver Holt. Vincent said, your defense attorney? He's the best, Damien said. And he's going to want to know about the fabricated evidence against Elena before those federal agents knock on any doors. He paused. The timeline matters. Marcus filed a tip tonight. If it comes out that Marcus, an official cooperating witness, manufactured evidence and framed an innocent woman as part of his cooperation deal, the federal case has a witness credibility problem that will take months to untangle. Unless they decide to proceed without him, Renzo said. You can try. But the financial architecture Marcus handed them, he was the primary documenting witness for most of it. Without his credibility, they're going to have to rebuild a significant portion of the evidentiary foundation. He picked up his phone. It doesn't make the case disappear, but it changes the landscape. He was already dialing Holt's emergency line. He'd used it twice in 15 years, and Carver Holt, who was 71 years old and had been practicing criminal defense for 4 decades, and had the particular quality of a man who was never surprised by what clients called him about at 4 a.m, picked up on the second ring. Damien, he said. I have about 90 seconds to explain a situation, Damien said. Then I need you to tell me what you need from me tonight. Talk, Holt said. Damien talked. He laid it out in the clipped, sequential way. He laid everything out, the frame on Elena, the documentation Vincent had gathered, the access logs, the fabricated timestamps, Brennan, the anonymous tip, the arrest warrant, the federal cooperation deal Marcus had been running. He talked for 80 seconds without stopping. When he finished, Holt was quiet for 4 seconds. The documentation, Holt said. Hotel records, photographs, financial timestamps, it's all original source material. Not copies of copies? Original. Where is the woman right now? With me. Safe location, the child with her. Another brief pause. Get me everything Vincent Marlowe has by 5 a.m. All of it, original format, nothing curated. I want the unedited picture, he paused. If what you're describing is accurate, and I'm not saying I disbelieve you, I'm saying I need to verify before I represent anything to anyone, then we have the foundation for a motion that will create significant complications for the federal prosecution. It will not make the underlying financial charges disappear. You understand that? I understand that. You are going to need to have a conversation about cooperation, Holt said. It was not a question, and it was not phrased as a suggestion. I know, Damien said. That's a conversation for after I've seen the documents, not before. Holt's voice shifted slightly, the particular shift of a man who has been doing something professionally for 40 years and occasionally allows himself a single unguarded observation. You've made this considerably more complicated than it needed to be, Damien. I know that too. Get me the documents. I'll be in my office at 6. Holt hung up. Damien lowered the phone. The room had been quiet during the call. Now Elena looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard half a conversation and filled in most of the other half. Cooperation, she said. It's a conversation for later. No. Her voice was even. It's a conversation for now, because if you're going to make decisions about what you're offering to federal investigators, I need to understand what that means for Nora, for her name, for her future. He looked at her. He understood what she was asking, and she was right to ask it. And he hadn't yet looked directly at that particular dimension of what was coming. Anything I cooperate on, he said, I'll structure to protect what I can. The legitimate holdings, the assets that were built on clean money. He paused. I won't be able to protect everything. I'm not asking about everything, she said. I'm asking about her. He looked at Nora, asleep in the corner of the couch, surrounded by cushions. Vincent had arranged with the focused anxiety of an uncle who has no idea what he's doing, but is trying very hard. His daughter, Nora Cross, 8 pounds and 2 ounces and oblivious. She'll be protected, he said. Came out rougher than he intended. The roughness of a man making a promise he's not certain. He has the capacity to keep, and saying it anyway, because some things you have to say out loud before you can figure out how to make them true. I will make sure of that. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then Renzo's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He crossed to it, read the screen, and looked up. My guy on the outside, he said. 2 federal vehicles just left the field office. They're heading east. East was toward the estate. They had maybe an hour before those vehicles worked outward. We need to move Vincent's documentation to Holt, Damien said. Now. Everything. He looked at his phone. I need to call 2 of my people and tell them to stand down, go home. Don't run. Cooperate if they're approached. The more my people run tonight, the worse the picture looks. And us, Vincent said. Damien looked at the room. At Elena on the couch with Nora. At Renzo near the door. At Vincent, arms crossed, watching him with the expression of a man who has handed his sister's safety to someone he has every reason not to trust, and is now waiting to see if that was the worst decision of his life. He looked at his phone one more time. At the news alert. The arrest warrant. Then he looked up. There's something I haven't told you, he said. The room waited. The message I got tonight, he said. The anonymous one. It said to check who signed Elena's intake form at St. Vincent's. He looked at Renzo. I forwarded it to you. I pulled it, Renzo said. He said it with the careful voice of a man who has been waiting to be asked and is not looking forward to answering. The intake form for room 412, Elena Marlowe. He paused. The admitting signature, the staff member who registered her intake. It's a name that doesn't match any current St. Vincent's employee on record. The room went still. Someone placed a person inside that hospital, Renzo said, before Elena arrived. Before we got there, they knew she was coming. Elena's face went a shade paler. That's not possible, she said. I didn't tell anyone I was going to that hospital. I didn't even decide on St. Vincent's until I was in the cab. I told the driver to change course twice. Someone was tracking your phone, Renzo said. I didn't have my phone on me. I left it at the apartment. I've been operating on a burner for 3 months. Her voice was steady, but her hand, the one spread across Nora's back, had gone tight. Nobody had the number of that burner. Nobody. Damien looked at Vincent. Vincent looked back at him, and on his face was an expression that Damien had not seen there before, not the anger, not the exhaustion, not the controlled fury of a protective older brother. Something younger than all of that. Something that looked very much like fear. Vincent, Damien said. I didn't tell anyone, Vincent said. Who knew you were coming to the hospital tonight? Nobody. I didn't. He stopped. His hands came off his arms. He looked at the phone in his pocket with the expression of a man who has just felt the ground move. I called my supervisor this afternoon. I told him I was going to need to take personal time, that I had a family situation. I didn't say where. I didn't say what hospital. What's your supervisor's name? Damien said. Vincent said a name. Damien looked at Renzo. Renzo pulled out his phone and started typing. 20 seconds passed. The only sound was Nora's breathing and the distant sound of the city 4 stories below. Then Renzo looked up. Carl Innes, he said, contracted to a security consulting firm called Meridian Group. He looked at Damien. Meridian Group was registered 2 years ago. The principal is listed as a holding company. He paused. The holding company traces back to Marcus Vane. The silence in the room was total. Vincent's face did something Damien had not seen it do in the hours since they'd met it cracked. Not dramatically, not expressively, but in the way something cracks when the weight on it has exceeded what it was built to hold. His jaw tightened. His eyes went somewhere inward and stayed there for a moment that was difficult to watch. "He's been watching me," Vincent said. "The whole time." He said it quietly, with the particular flatness of a man absorbing something catastrophic and deciding to deal with the shape of it first before allowing himself to feel it fully. "I thought I was tracking him. He was tracking me. Everything you found," Damien said. "Every thread you pulled, he knew." "He let me find it," Vincent said. "It came out like something being pulled up from somewhere deep. He let me find the documentation. He let me build the file. Because if I built it and if I brought it to you." He stopped. He worked through it, the logic of it, visibly. "If I brought you the documentation that proved Elena was framed, and you used it, and the federal case got complicated, then Marcus is already positioned on the other side. Already covered. He's already the cooperating witness. They protect him regardless of what I have, because he gave them the financial architecture, and that's worth more to them than the fact that he framed her," Elena said. Her voice was very quiet. She was sitting very still on the couch, with her hand on Nora's back, and her face doing something that was not quite any one thing, not fear, not fury, not grief, but some compound of all three that had been compacted under pressure into something harder and colder and entirely without softness. She looked at Damien. "We built our escape on documentation he let Vincent find," she said. "We were ahead of him because he wanted us to think we were ahead of him." She paused, and the pause was the length of a woman finishing a calculation she had started the moment Renzo said the name Meridian Group. "And now we're sitting at a safe house that Marcus doesn't have the address of, which is the only thing tonight that's still actually true." "Yes," Damien said. "So what do we actually have?" she said. "Not what we thought we had. What we actually have." He looked at her. He looked at his daughter. He looked at the phone in his hand with the arrest warrant notification on its screen, and the empty legal architecture of a case he had thought he was dismantling, and he felt the particular sensation of a man who has built his entire adult life on the premise that he is always the one who sees the board most clearly, discovering that he has been a piece on someone else's board. "We have this location," he said. "We have the documentation. Marcus may have let Vincent find it, but the documentation is still real. The records, the photographs, they still prove Elena wasn't there during that window. They can still complicate his credibility as a witness." He paused. "And we have something Marcus doesn't know we have." "What?" Vincent said. Damien looked at the anonymous message on his phone. "Someone inside this tonight sent me that tip about the intake form," he said. "Someone who knew about Marcus's plant at the hospital, who knew enough to point me at it, and who is not Marcus." He looked at the number the message had come from. "Marcus doesn't run a clean operation, he runs a patient one. Patient operations require people who are paid to be patient. And people who are paid to be patient sometimes decide, at 4 in the morning, in the middle of a federal enforcement action, that they were not paid enough." He looked at Renzo. "I need to make a call." "To who?" Renzo said. Damien looked at the number on his screen. "To whoever just decided they're on the wrong side of this," he said, and pressed dial. The phone rang once, and twice, and on the third ring it was answered, and the voice on the other end was not a voice Damien recognized, but it was the voice of someone who sounded like a person sitting in a parked car, in the dark deciding between two futures, which was exactly what Damien had expected, and he began to speak before the other person could change their mind. The voice on the other end of the line was male, mid-30s by the sound of it, carrying the specific tension of someone who has made a decision and is now sitting inside the consequences of it, waiting to see if the consequences were survivable. "You got my message," the man said. "I got it," Damien said. "Who are you?" A pause. Not the pause of someone deciding whether to answer, but the pause of someone deciding how much of the answer to give. "My name doesn't matter right now," the man said. "What matters is that I've been inside Marcus Vane's secondary operation for 14 months, and what he authorized tonight crossed a line I wasn't willing to cross." "What did he authorize?" Another pause, shorter, the woman, and the baby. His voice went flat on those last two words, the flatness of a man putting distance between himself and something. "I was told the original brief was to apply pressure. Keep her moving, keep her scared, make sure she never got close enough to anyone to be credible. That's what I've been doing for 8 months. But tonight he stopped. Tonight the brief changed. The temperature in Damien's chest dropped. Say it plainly, Damien said. Marcus wants her gone, the man said. Not moved. Not scared. Gone. He's been building toward it the federal cooperation deal, the arrest warrant he needed to tie off every loose thread before the case went to prosecution. Elena Marlowe is a loose thread. The documentation her brother assembled is a loose thread. A pause. You weren't supposed to be at that hospital tonight. That complicated his timeline. Damien looked across the room at Elena. She was watching his face and reading it the way she'd always been able to read his face. And what she saw there made her pull Nora slightly closer without changing her expression. Plant at the hospital, Damien said. The person on the intake form. Mine, the man said. I put her there. I was supposed to confirm the target's location and signal Brennan's team. He paused. Confirmed the location. I didn't send the signal. Why? The line was quiet for 3 seconds. She had a baby, the man said. I watched the intake process. She came in alone, and he stopped. I've done a lot of things in the last 14 months that I'm going to have to live with. I'm not doing that. Damien breathed through the thing that was happening in his chest, kept his voice controlled. Where is Brennan now? That's why I'm calling you. The man's voice shifted the controlled urgency of someone who has been watching a clock. Brennan doesn't know I didn't send the signal. He's been waiting for confirmation that wasn't coming, but he's not a patient man, and it's been long enough that he's going to move on his own read of the situation. I don't know exactly where he is, but I know he has 4 men, and I know Marcus gave him a window that closes at 6 a.m. And Damien looked at the clock on the wall. 4:51 a.m., 69 minutes. You said the documentation Elena's brother built is a loose thread, Damien said. Marcus knows about the documentation. He's known for 6 months. He let it develop because he thought it was contained. He thought it led to him being able to control when and how it surfaced. He didn't anticipate you being at the hospital tonight. You changed his calculation. Where does he think we are right now? He doesn't know this location. But he has your attorney's office under surveillance, and if you contact Holt, the man paused. He's monitoring for contact with Holt specifically. He has a source inside the firm. Damien turned away from the room and pressed his hand flat against the wall and looked at the paint. Carver Holt. He had called Holt 40 minutes ago. He had told Holt about the documentation. He had told Holt they needed to meet at 6. If Marcus had a source inside Holt's firm, how deep is the source, Damien said. Paralegal. 3 years in. She's been on retainer to Marcus since before that. A pause. Your call to Holt tonight, the content of it, whatever you discussed, Marcus will have it within the hour, if he doesn't have it already. Damien pushed off the wall. He crossed the room in 4 steps. Renzo. Holt's office. We need to get there before Marcus's people do. Right now. Renzo was already on his feet. What's happening? Elena said. Marcus has a source inside my attorney's firm. He was already moving toward the door. Stopped. He looked at her and at Nora, and he made the calculation he didn't want to make. Couldn't take her with him. Holt's office was where Marcus expected him to go. It was a potential trap, and walking in with Elena and a newborn was not a risk he was going to take. But leaving her here with the clock running down on Brennan's window was also not a risk he was going to take. Vincent, he said. Vincent straightened. You stay here, both of you. He looked at his phone, pulled up a contact, and called it. It rang once. I need you at a location in 20 minutes, he said when it was answered. Armed. Don't tell anyone where you're going. He gave the address and hung up. He looked at Vincent. 2 of my men who Marcus has no connection to. They'll be here in 20 minutes. You do not open the door until you hear a specific knock, 3 short, 2 long. Understand? Vincent nodded. Damien looked at Elena. She was watching him, with the expression she'd had in the delivery room. Not fear, but something beyond fear. The place you arrive at, when fear has been metabolized into something more durable. Her hand was on Nora's back. Come back, she said. 2 words. It was not a command and it was not a plea. It was the specific statement of a woman who has learned not to ask for more than what she needs. Yes, he said. He said it. He had said the promise 3 years ago in the kitchen. The way you say things before you know what they'll cost, except this time he knew. This time he was saying it fully informed, with both eyes open, with the complete understanding of what not coming back would mean. He went through the door. The city at 5 in the morning had a quality that no other hour produced, not the genuine quiet of deep night, not the building energy of early morning, but the specific suspended state between them, when the streets were emptied of everything, except the people who had reasons to be out that they wouldn't want to explain. Renzo drove. Damien sat in the passenger seat this time, not the back, and he had his phone out and was moving through 3 conversations simultaneously, his contact finishing the pull on Marcus's secondary communication records, the man from the call whose name he still didn't have sending him the last known location data for Brennan, and a 4th party who Damien had contacted only once before in his life, a man who operated in the particular space between institutional law enforcement and the kind of enforcement that institutions preferred not to acknowledge. The 4th party's name was Garrett Webb. He'd worked federal intelligence for 22 years and had left under circumstances that were not publicly documented and that Webb had never explained to anyone in Damien's hearing. He had been useful twice. He was going to be useful a 3rd time. Garrett, Damien said when the call connected. I heard there's a warrant, Webb said. No greeting, no preamble. The voice of a man who existed in a permanent state of already knowing things. Marcus Vane, Damien said. He's a cooperating witness on the case. I have documentation that he fabricated evidence and framed an innocent 3rd party as part of his cooperation deal. I also have reason to believe he has an active operation running tonight that is going to cross into territory that makes his cooperation deal radioactive if it's documented correctly. Defined correctly. I need someone with the right credentials to be in the right place when Brennan moves, Damienson said. Not my people. Someone who can make an official record of what happens. Pause. You're asking me to position myself as a witness to a federal cooperating witness ordering an attempted murder. I'm asking you to be where the truth is happening, Damien said. What you do with what you see is your professional judgment. Another pause, longer where. Damien looked at the location data the unnamed caller had sent him. Brennan's last known position 40 minutes ago, a parking structure 3 blocks from the safe house. Either he'd moved or he was still there, and either way the geometry of it told Damien something about Brennan's planned approach. He gave Webb the location. 30 minutes, Webb said and disconnected. Renzo glanced at him. You trust Webb? I trust that Webb has his own reasons to want Marcus Vane's cooperation deal to collapse, Damien said. That's enough. Holt's office was in a building that was old enough to have a night security desk staffed by an actual person rather than a card reader, which meant the security guard looked up when Damien and Renzo came through the lobby doors at 5:10 with the particular alertness of a man who has learned that people who arrive before the building opens usually have a reason. Damien showed him a card. Not identification, a contact card, with a number that Holt had given him years ago for exactly this category of situation. The guard called the number, listened, and nodded, and pressed the elevator button without further conversation. Holt was already in his office. He was 71 and looked it, but only in the physical sense the age was in his hands and in the lines around his eyes, not in the sharpness behind them. He was in his shirt sleeves with a coffee that was probably his second and a legal pad already covered in handwriting. He looked at Damien when he came through the door, and then he looked at Renzo, and then he said, Sit down and tell me what's happened since we spoke, Damien told him. All of it the source inside the firm, the paralegal, the content of their earlier call potentially compromised. He told him about Webb, he told him about Brennan and the 6A, M window. Holt listened without interrupting. His pen moved occasionally on the legal pad. When Damien finished, Holt put the pen down. The paralegal, he said. Her name. Damien told him what the unnamed caller had told him. Holt's face did something that was not surprise, but was the older, quieter version of it, the recognition of something that had been possible and is now confirmed. Stood up, went to the door of his office, and spoke to someone in the outer area, in a voice too low to hear. Then he came back. She's not in the building yet, he said. She comes in at 7. Anything discussed in this office before 7 is not compromised. He sat back down. Now the documentation. Vincent is transmitting it now, Damien said. He checked his phone. The files were uploading hotel records, photographs, the financial timestamps, all of it. It'll be complete in 10 minutes. And the communication records from Marcus's secondary channels, coming through a separate route. Another 20 minutes. Holt picked up his pen again. Here's what I can do tonight, and here is what I cannot do tonight. And I need you to hear the distinction clearly. He looked at Damien over the pad. What I can do, file an emergency motion challenging the credibility of the federal prosecution's cooperating witness on the grounds of fabricated evidence. The hotel records and photographs, if they hold up to scrutiny, and they will hold up. Because real documentation always does create a prima facie case that Marcus Vane constructed false evidence as part of his cooperation deal. That is a significant problem for the prosecution. They will not simply absorb it. It will create delay. It will create internal review. It will, at minimum, complicate the warrant execution. And what you can't do, Damien said. I cannot make the underlying financial charges disappear, Holt said. They are real. The evidence for them, even without Marcus, as the primary documenting witness, is extensive enough that the prosecution can restructure around the credibility challenge. It will take them time, but they can do it. He paused. Damien. The conversation about cooperation that I mentioned earlier. I need you to be ready to have it. I know, not in the abstract. Specifically. There are things you can offer that would. I know what I can offer, Damien said. I've been running through it since 4 a.m. He looked at the legal pad, at Holt's handwriting, at the shape of a life being legally disassembled on a yellow page. Whatever I offer, Elena Marlowe is excluded from the financial structure in the official record. Completely. Any account, any entity, anything that touches her name, I want it, documented that her access was nominal and non-operational. Because it was. She was never part of the operation. Marcus used her credentials without her knowledge. The documentation supports that. Then, it needs to be in writing before I discuss anything else. Holt looked at him for a moment. The look of a man who has spent 40 years watching people make decisions that reveal what they actually value, and is watching one happen now. All right, he said. He wrote something on the pad. I'll have a preliminary motion drafted by 6:30. I'll contact the prosecution's office at 7, when I can do so through official channels, and put them on notice about the witness credibility issue. He paused. In the meantime, Brennan. I'm handling Brennan, Damien said. Damien? It's being handled through channels that won't create additional exposure, he said. Webb will be there. Holt's expression went through something complex. Garrett Webb's name was not unfamiliar to him, and the familiar was not entirely comfortable. But he looked at his legal pad, and he made another note, and he said nothing further about it. His phone buzzed when he was back in the elevator. Renzo's contact the outer perimeter. One of Marcus's vehicles had been spotted moving east, away from the area of the safe house, which meant either Marcus had decided to pull back, or he'd received information that had changed his read. Then a second message, from the unnamed caller. Brennan is moving. Left the parking structure 7 minutes ago. 2 vehicles. Damien looked at the time. 5:34 a.m. 26 minutes before the 6 a.m. window closed. Brennan wasn't waiting. He called Vincent. Vincent answered on the first ring. My men got there, Damien said. 3-2 knock. They're here, Vincent said. What's happening? Brennan is moving. 2 vehicles left his position 7 minutes ago. Keep the door locked. Keep the lights low. And do not answer anything that isn't the knock. If anything comes through that door that isn't my people, you go out the window at the back bedroom. Fire escape, down to the alley. There's a blue door at the end of the alley. It's a dry cleaner. They open at 5:30. You stay inside and you call me. A silence on Vincent's end. Not the silence of someone deciding whether to comply, but the silence of someone memorizing. Elena knows, Vincent said. Tell her, Damien said. She needs to know the plan. She's not going to like being the person in the room who follows the plan. No, Damien said, she's not. He hung up. He looked at Renzo. I need to be at that building. Renzo didn't argue. He drove. The neighborhood around the safe house looked the same as it had. At 4 a.m, quiet streets. Mature trees, the unremarkable face of a place that had decided decades ago to simply continue existing without incident. But something in it had changed. Or maybe Damien was reading it differently now. The way you read a room differently when you know something is inside it that wasn't there before. He had Renzo park 1 block over, in a spot that gave a sight line to the corner without being visible from the building's entrance. He got out of the car and moved on foot, coat collar up, hands in his pockets, the practiced invisibility of a man who had learned in his 20s how to be present in a space without announcing it. He saw the first of Brennan's vehicles before he reached the corner. A dark SUV, parked on the opposite side of the street from the building, engine off. Occupied, he couldn't see how many, but the slight condensation forming on the inside of the passenger window told him at least 2. Kept moving. He didn't look directly at the SUV. He moved past it on the sidewalk, with the unhurried pace of someone who belonged on this street at 5:30 in the morning, which was the pace of nobody, but the right nobody, the kind whose presence didn't register, because there was nothing about it that demanded attention. He reached the mouth of the alley that ran behind the building and stopped. Webb was already there. Garrett Webb was 6 feet tall and had the physical quality of someone who had once been built for field work and had maintained enough of it to still be credible lean, with the kind of stillness that wasn't calm but was its cousin, stillness of a man managing a high resting level of readiness. He was in plain clothes. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and he was watching the back of the building with the focused, patient attention of someone who knows something is coming and is simply waiting for it to arrive. He looked at Damien when he came into the alley. He didn't look surprised. 2 vehicles, Webb said. I count 4 men. Brennan's in the first vehicle. He paused. One of them went around back 20 minutes ago. He's on the fire escape at the east side. East fire escape. Not the one Damien had told Vincent to use. The back bedroom window accessed the west fire escape. He had specified it deliberately, but not explained why. Because he hadn't known about the east side positioning. One thing right. What are you carrying? Damien said. Webb looked at him with the expression of a man who finds certain questions either obvious or offensive. Nothing that connects to anything, he said. I'm here as an observer, officially and unofficially. Unofficially, I'll make decisions in real time based on what I see. He looked back at the building. You have people inside too. Brennan has 4 outside and 1 on the fire escape. He paused. He's going to move before 6. He doesn't know the federal window is soft. Marcus told him there was a hard deadline, and Brennan plans around hard information. He'll move in the next 15 minutes. Damien looked at the building. 3rd floor, west side. Elena was in there with Nora and Vincent and 2 of his men, and somewhere behind this building, a man was sitting on a fire escape, watching the wrong window. Pulled out his phone and sent a message to the 2 men inside, man on east fire escape. Do not use east exit. Hold position, then he called the unnamed man. Brennan doesn't know you didn't signal, Damien said when the call connected. Can you reach him? I can reach him, the man said. Cautious. I need you to tell him there's been a complication at the primary location. Tell him Marcus wants him to pull back and wait for confirmation. Buy me 15 minutes. A long pause. If he finds out He's not going to find out anything, Damien said. Because in 15 minutes, this is going to be over. And what you did tonight is going to be on the right side of the record. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Another pause. You're telling me Webb is there. I'm telling you that what happens in the next 15 minutes is going to be documented by someone whose documentation carries weight, Damien said. And the man who pulled back before it escalated is in a different category from the man who didn't. The line was quiet for 4 seconds. I'll call him, the man said. He disconnected. Damien looked at Webb. 15 minutes. 12, Webb said. He'd been watching the SUV at the end of the street. Brennan just got out of the vehicle. Damien turned. Brennan was across the street, standing beside the SUV's open door, phone to his ear. Medium height, thickly built, wearing a coat that was too heavy for the weather, in a way that said what was under it. He was listening to someone on the phone. Damien watched him listen. He watched the body language shift, the slight backward lean of a man receiving unexpected information, the jaw tightening, the free hand coming up and pressing flat against the roof of the SUV in a way that might have looked casual and wasn't. Brennan was getting the call. He kept listening for 30 seconds. Then he said something short and pulled the phone from his ear and stood beside the vehicle, with his hand still on its roof, and looked at the building across the street. He looked at it for a long time. Damien didn't breathe. Or he breathed, but he couldn't feel it, the particular compression of a moment in which the next thing that happens will determine several other things, and there is nothing to do but wait and watch and be ready for either branch. Brennan put his phone in his pocket. He said something to the man behind him, who was still in the SUV. Then he stepped away from the vehicle and started walking toward the building. He wasn't pulling back. Damien's hand was already moving when Webb said, quietly and without drama, I see it, and stepped out of the alley onto the sidewalk with his credentials already out. Danny Brennan, Webb said, loud enough to carry. His voice had the specific quality of institutional authority, not aggressive, not tentative. The voice of a man who has spent decades being the thing other men stop for. Federal agent. I need you to stop and put your hands where I can see them. Brennan stopped. The man in the SUV moved. Damien saw at the passenger door opening, a figure starting to come out, and he was already moving across the street. And what happened in the next 40 seconds was not clean or cinematic or anything like the version of it that would exist in anyone's later description of the event. Brennan turned toward Webb with the look of a man doing the calculation of it, how far, how many, what the cost, and Webb held position, with the particular patience of someone who knows that in this specific calculation they are the better option, and after 3 seconds that were long in the way, seconds get long under pressure, Brennan put his hands up. The man from the SUV was on the sidewalk, and then he wasn't, because Renzo had come around the block from the other direction with 2 of Damien's men, and the geometry of the street had changed completely. In the time it took Brennan to make his calculation, and the man from the SUV looked at his new geometry and made his own calculation and put his hands up too. The man on the east fire escape came down when he heard it. He looked at the street and he put his hands up without being asked, which was the action of a man who had been in this category of situation enough times to recognize when it had concluded. Damien stood in the street. His heart was moving at a rate he could feel in his throat. His hands were steady. They were always steady, but the rest of him was doing something that wasn't quite shaking, but was the internal equivalent of it. The vibration of a system under significant load. Webb had Brennan's arm and was talking to him in a low, specific voice, the voice of a man explaining the precise dimensions of the situation. Was listening with the face of a man who had arrived at a place he'd always known was theoretically possible, and was adjusting to the fact that it was now actual. Damien looked at the building. 3rd floor, west side. Behind that facade, Elena was in there, and Nora, and Vincent, and 2 of his men who had held position and done what they were told. He looked at his phone. He called Vincent. It rang twice. "Done," Damien said when Vincent answered. A pause on the other end. He heard Vincent exhale, a long, compressed exhale, the kind that carries a lot of time in it. "She's okay?" Damien said. Vincent's voice was rough. Nora slept through the whole thing. Damien looked at the street, at Webb talking into his own phone now, setting the official version of events into motion. At Brennan, sitting on the curb with his hands behind him, looking at the pavement with the specific expression of a man, deciding what he's willing to say. Damien stopped. He had been about to say something, but the right version of it wasn't available in this moment, standing in a wet street at 5:45 in the morning, with the adrenaline still moving through him, and the case against his empire waiting at the other end of the day, and whatever he wanted to tell Elena through her brother was not the kind of thing that arrived complete in these conditions. "Tell her I'm coming back," he said. "I'll tell her," Vincent said. He hung up. He stood in the street and looked at the sky, which had begun to change in the east, the particular color that wasn't light yet, but was the announcement of light, the first suggestion that the night had an end and the end was close. Behind him, Webb was completing his official documentation of what had just been observed, which was a federal cooperating witnesses contractor attempting to carry out what would be formally characterized as a witness intimidation operation, which was a problem for Marcus Vane that went far beyond what Holt's motion would create in the prosecution's office, and which Damien had understood from the beginning of this night was the only play that had a real ending. Not firepower, not the Empire's leverage, documentation. The thing Marcus had used to destroy Elena was the thing that was going to destroy Marcus. Damien Cross, who had spent 20 years believing that power was the only language that mattered, stood in the street at the end of the longest night of his life and felt the specific, unfamiliar sensation of a man who is standing at the boundary of what he has been and what he is going to have to become. He didn't know yet what that looked like. He knew it started with going back up those stairs. He turned toward the building and he walked. Behind him, the first edge of morning light broke the line of the eastern rooftops, pale and cold and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened beneath it, and Damien Cross moved through it toward the door, and the door opened, and he went in. The elevator in the building was too slow, so Damien took the stairs. He went up 3 flights with his hand on the railing and the sound of his own breathing in the stairwell, and at the 3rd floor landing, he stopped and stood outside the door for a moment that was neither long nor short but had a specific weight to it, the weight of a man preparing himself for something he doesn't have a template for. Something that isn't negotiation or strategy, or the careful management of other people's perceptions, but is simply the harder thing of walking into a room and being honest about what he is. He knocked. 3 short, 2 long. The door opened immediately, which meant Vincent had been standing beside it. He looked at Damien's face and read whatever was there and stepped back without saying anything, which was the most useful thing he could have done. Damien came in. Elena was sitting on the couch with Nora against her chest, and she looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the delivery room, in the corridor, in every room they'd been in together tonight with the full, undeflected attention of a woman who had been reading him for years and had not lost the ability, even after 3 years of practice with his absence. She took in his coat, the street still on him, the specific physical quality of a man who has been outside in the cold doing something and has just come in. "It's done," she said. "Not a question. Brennan is in custody." He came farther into the room. He looked at the 2 men he'd sent. They were near the window, alert but standing down, reading the room correctly. He looked at Vincent. "I need a few minutes." Vincent nodded. He said something quiet to the 2 men, and they went to the far end of the apartment, and Vincent went with them. And for the first time since the hospital, it was just Damien and Elena and Nora in a room together. Damien sat in the chair across from her. The same relative geography as an hour ago, except something had changed in the air between them. The pressure of the immediate physical threat had released, and what was left in its absence was the older and more complicated thing. The thing that had been there since he walked into that delivery room 8 hours ago and hadn't gone anywhere, while everything else was happening around it. "Tell me," Elena said. He told her. All of it, from Webb to Brennan, to the unnamed caller, to what Holt was filing at 7, to what the cooperation conversation was going to look like. He laid it out the way he laid everything out, sequential, clear, no softening of the parts that were hard. She listened without interrupting, which was how she'd always listened, the particular discipline of a woman who understood that the full picture was more useful than the managed version. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Nora made a small sound against her chest, not crying, just the small adjustments of a sleeping baby shifting weight. Elena's hand moved across her back automatically, the gesture that had already become reflexive in 8 hours, and the sight of it did something to Damien's chest that he didn't try to name. "The cooperation deal," Elena said. "What does it actually mean for the Empire?" "It means it's over," he said. "Not a restructured version of it. Not a quieter version. The criminal architecture, everything that built the cross name into what it is, the organization. The network, I give it up completely. I document it. I cooperate on the prosecution of the people inside it, and in exchange, the federal prosecution is restructured around my cooperation rather than my conviction. You'll still be charged with things that carry significantly reduced exposure," he said. "Holt believes he can negotiate a settlement that doesn't include prison time, given the scope of what I'm willing to offer, and the complications to the prosecution's case that Marcus's witness credibility problem creates." He paused. "He doesn't guarantee it. He thinks it's achievable. And Marcus's cooperation deal collapses the moment Holt's motion is in front of the prosecution's office," Damien said. "A cooperating witness who manufactured evidence and framed an innocent person and who simultaneously authorized an operation against that person tonight. The prosecution can't protect him. They'd be building their case on testimony from someone whose conduct in the course of cooperating constitutes additional crimes." He looked at her directly. "He goes to trial without a deal. With everything I know about his operation, which is considerably more than what he gave them about mine." Elena absorbed that. She looked down at Nora. Something moved across her face, not satisfaction, not relief, but the particular expression of a woman at the end of something very long. Something that has cost her more than she's going to be able to calculate for a while yet. 3 years, she said quietly. Not to Damien specifically, to the room, or to herself, or to Nora, to whoever was the right recipient of the weight of it. "I know," he said. "You don't know." She said it without heat, factually. "You know what 3 years looks like from the outside. You don't know what they felt like from the inside." She paused, moving every few months, sleeping with a bag packed, learning to not use my real name without flinching, not telling my own brother for 4 months that I was pregnant because I didn't want him to feel responsible for me. She stopped. Her jaw worked. I had an entire conversation with myself, in a bathroom, in a city I'd lived in for 6 weeks, about whether you should know I was pregnant, whether bringing you back into the situation would protect Nora or put her in more danger. She paused. I decided it would put her in more danger. I decided you were part of what I was running from. The room was very quiet. "You were right," Damien said. She looked at him. "You were right to make that call," he said. "Given what you knew and what I'd done, you were right to decide I was part of the danger. I was. Not because I wanted to be, but because I was careless with something I should have protected, and that carelessness had consequences you paid for. Not me." He held her gaze steadily. "I'm not going to tell you that you should have come to me. I'm not going to tell you that things would have been different if you had. I don't know if they would have been, and you had no reason to risk finding out." Elena looked at him for a long moment. That might be the most honest thing you've ever said to me, she said. I'm working on a new approach, he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile too early, too much still between them, for a smile to be the right thing, but something that acknowledged his words without dismissing them. The look of a woman who has heard something real and is deciding what to do with it. Holt called at 7:14. Damien stepped into the kitchen to take it. He stood with his back to the counter and listened. The motion had been filed. The prosecution's office had received it, and the initial response delivered, Holt said, with the particular controlled fury of a legal team that has just discovered their cooperating witness has created a catastrophic problem in the middle of an active enforcement action, indicated they were pulling back the warrant execution pending internal review. Damien would need to come into Holt's office that morning, not to surrender to negotiate. There was a significant difference, and Holt was firm on the characterization. Damien was not a man surrendering to a superior force. He was a man who had decided to end something and was managing the terms of that ending, which was a distinction that mattered both legally and in every other way. How long do we have before I need to be there? Damien said. 10 o'clock, Holt said. I need 2 hours with you before we sit down with their team. I'll be there at 8. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at the counter, at the unremarkable surface of it, at the particular mundanity of a kitchen in a safe house at 7 in the morning, and he breathed. Then he went back to the main room. Elena was feeding Nora. She looked up when he came in with the particular expression of a woman who has been doing something that requires her complete attention and has also been listening for him with the other part of herself. Holt, she said, the prosecution is pausing the warrant. I need to be at his office at 8. He looked at her, then at the apartment around them. You can stay here as long as you need. My men will stay with you. The location is still clean. For how long? She said. Until I know the situation is stable, he said. A few days, maybe. Holt will be able to give a clearer picture after this morning. Elena looked at Nora, then back at him. She had the expression of a woman doing a calculation that was different from the legal and logistical ones. He'd been running all night a more personal calculation, with different variables. When this is done, she said, when the legal thing is settled and Marcus is dealt with, and there's no one left with a reason to come after us, what does that look like for you? Not legally. Just what does your life look like? He thought about it. He'd been thinking about it in the margins of everything else all night, in the spaces between calls and moves and decisions, the shape of what came after. I have legitimate holdings, he said. Real estate. 2 businesses that were built on clean money and have clean books. They'll survive the cooperation deal. Holt is structuring the agreement to protect them specifically. He paused. Smaller than what I had. Significantly smaller. But it's real. And the rest of it? The rest of it is gone, he said. That's what the cooperation means. She held his gaze. Are you okay with that? It was a real question. She was asking it the way she asked things directly, without softening, wanting the real answer. He thought about the empire, the network, the 20 years of building something formidable and feared. He thought about what it had cost and what it had protected and what it had ultimately failed to protect, which was the one thing that had mattered. I'm more okay with it than I expected to be, he said. She nodded slowly. Not accepting it as a complete answer, but accepting it as a true one, which was enough for this moment. He left at 7:40. At the door he stopped and looked back at her. She was on the couch with Nora, in the crook of her arm, looking at the baby's face with the particular absorptions of someone in the early days of something enormous, learning the geography of it. She looked up. He opened his mouth to say something and then didn't, because the thing he wanted to say was not yet his, to say it existed in a territory they hadn't reached yet. That would take time to reach honestly, and saying it now would be the wrong version of it. The version that came out of this specific night, with all its weight and fear and clarity, rather than out of the slower, harder work of actually becoming trustworthy again. Be careful, she said. Yes, he said. He left. The meeting at Holt's office lasted 4 hours. The prosecution's team was 3 people, a lead attorney named Fowler, who was in his mid-40s and had the specific quality of a man who is furious and professional in equal measure, and 2 assistants, who said very little and took extensive notes. Holt had Damien on one side and a financial forensics specialist on the other, and the documentation was on the table between them in organized, comprehensive form: the hotel records, the photographs, the access logs with the secondary record Marcus hadn't known existed, the communication data from his secondary channels, Webb's official report on the events outside the safe house, and the statement from the unnamed caller who had, by 7 in the morning, made the decision to become a named caller in exchange for the kind of considerations that the night's events had made available to him. Fowler went through the documentation with the expression of a man eating something that tasted bad and had to eat it anyway. Marcus Vane's cooperation deal was formally suspended at 10:52 in the morning. Holt read the suspension notice with the measured expression of a man who has been in this profession long enough to know that satisfaction is a luxury for after, not during, and made a single brief note on his pad. The cooperation terms for Damien were outlined across 90 minutes. They were not painless. They were not designed to be. He gave up the financial architecture of the criminal organization in its entirety: names, accounts, structures, operations, the full and documented map of 20 years. He gave it up without negotiating around the edges of it, without trying to protect pieces of it, because Holt had told him, and he understood that the completeness of what he offered was the only thing that distinguished it from what Marcus had offered, and he was not going to be Marcus Vane. In exchange, the prosecution agreed to a structured settlement on the underlying charges, a substantial financial penalty, 3 years of supervised probation, the permanent surrender of any interest in the criminal network, and the cooperation commitment in any subsequent prosecutions. No prison time contingent on compliance. It was not a victory. Damien hadn't walked in expecting a victory. He had walked in expecting an ending, which was different, and an ending was what he got. Fowler looked at him when the terms were signed with the expression of a man who wants to say something and is professionally constrained from saying it, and Damien looked back at him with the expression of a man who understands exactly what is being not said, and is neither defensive about it nor interested in performing remorse for a room, and they shook hands in the way that professional men shake hands at the conclusion of something neither of them particularly enjoyed. Holt walked him out. In the elevator, Holt looked at the floor display and said, "Elena Marlowe's name will be formally cleared in the documentation. The fabricated evidence will be noted in the official record as fabricated, and her nominal access to the financial accounts will be categorized as non-operational and without knowledge." He paused. "Her name is clean." "Good," Damien said. "It'll take a few days for the formal processing, but it's done." Holt looked at him. "What are you going to do now?" Damien looked at the elevator doors. "Go back to the apartment." And after that, he thought about what he'd said to Elena that morning. The legitimate holdings, the real estate, the 2 businesses. Smaller, real. "Figure out what I'm building," he said. "The right version of it." Holt made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite skepticism, but contained elements of both. The elevator opened. They walked out into the lobby, and Holt stopped and extended his hand. "For what it's worth," Holt said, "the documentation on the frame was comprehensive. It would have stood regardless of the other pressures on the prosecution. Whatever Vincent Marlowe was doing, for 2 years he built something real." Damien shook his hand. "I know." "Tell Elena." Holt stopped. He looked at his hand, then at Damien. "Tell her I'm sorry it took this long for someone with the right resources to be on the right side of it." "I'll tell her," Damien said. Marcus Vane was arrested at 2:17 that afternoon. Damien wasn't there for it. He heard about it through Renzo, who heard it through the same contact who'd been monitoring the federal channels since midnight. The arrest was made at Marcus's home, his actual home, not a secondary location, because Marcus had not run. Marcus had apparently made the calculation, in the hours since his cooperation deal collapsed, that running was an admission of the wrong kind, and that his best option was to wait and fight it legally. It was, Damien thought, the kind of calculation Marcus had always made patient, strategic, oriented toward the long game. It was also wrong in this specific instance, because the evidence against him was not the kind that legal strategy could erode over time. It was the kind that sat there and got heavier the more you looked at it. Damien sat with that for a while. Not with satisfaction he had promised himself. He wasn't going to feel satisfaction about Marcus, because satisfaction implied Marcus had mattered more than he did, and Marcus had been a problem to be solved, not a person to defeat. He sat with it the way you sit with the conclusion of something that took too long and cost too much and is finally actually finished. 15 years. He had trusted Marcus for 15 years. He sat with that too. The specific quality of having been wrong about something that fundamental for that long. He didn't try to make it smaller or explain it away. He let it be the size it was, because the only way forward from a mistake that big was through the actual understanding of it, not the managed version. He had been a man who trusted his own judgment, absolutely. He had been a man who, when presented with evidence that matched his fear, had accepted the evidence and acted on it without testing it, because testing it would have required sitting with the possibility that he was wrong, and he had not been able to sit with that. He understood now what that had cost. He went back to the apartment at 3 in the afternoon. The knock. 3 short, 2 long. Vincent opened the door. He looked at Damien's face and said, "How'd it go?" "It's done," Damien said. "Marcus is in custody. The deal is signed." He paused. "Elena's name is cleared in the official documentation." Vincent absorbed that. Something in his face went through a change that was complicated, and that Damien gave him the space to have without observation. The long exhale, the looking away for a moment, the particular quality of relief that has been deferred. For so long it doesn't arrive cleanly, but has to be processed in pieces. "Okay," Vincent said finally. "Okay." He stepped back from the door. "She's in the other room." He was. She was sitting in the chair by the window with Nora asleep in the portable crib the building manager had produced from a storage unit downstairs, and she was drinking tea from a mug that was probably from the safe house's minimal cupboard supply, and she looked up when Damien came in with the particular alertness of a woman who had been waiting and had been trying to look like she wasn't. He sat in the chair across from her, the same relative positions. The geography of the two of them, recurring. He told her. All of it, the meeting, the terms, the settlement, what Holt had said about her name. He told her about Marcus's arrest. He told her what Holt had asked him to pass on. She listened. She held her mug with both hands and she listened. And when he finished, she looked at the window for a moment, at the afternoon light coming through, kind of winter afternoon light that was pale and clean, and fell on everything evenly without preference. "My name," she said, not repeating it for clarification, processing it. "It's actually in there, in the official record. Formally cleared," he said. "The fabricated evidence is documented as fabricated. Your access was non-operational without knowledge. It's on the record." She looked at the mug in her hands. She looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and Damien let the silence be what it was. Because it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of a woman sitting with something she had needed for 3 years, and was now receiving, and needed a moment to let it be real. 3 years, she said quietly. She wasn't talking to him. She was talking to the space of it. 3 years of people looking at me like they knew something about me that I couldn't defend myself against. "It's in the record now," he said. "You can defend yourself." "I know." She looked up. She stopped. Strange. To have it be over. "I've been running for so long that I'd started to think the running was just going to be my life now. That I'd be moving Nora from city to city indefinitely, teaching her to answer to different names." She paused. "I'd started to think that was just what we were." "It's not what you are," he said. She looked at him. "No," she said. "It's not." The silence between them had a different quality now, not the pressure of immediate crisis, not the charged atmosphere of the hospital room or the safe house, or any of the rooms in between, but something slower and more complicated, and, underneath the complication, something that had the texture of ground rather than air. "I need to find somewhere to live," she said. "A real somewhere, not a month-to-month rental in a city I picked for its anonymity." She looked at Nora in the crib. "She deserves a room with a window and things on the wall." "I have properties," Damien said. "Nothing connected to the criminal organization Clean Holdings. There's a house outside the city. It has a garden." He paused. "It's yours if you want it." She looked at him. "That's not..." She started. "I'm not offering it as a transaction," he said. "I'm not offering it because I expect something from it. I'm offering it because you have a newborn and no fixed address, and you are owed significantly more than a house with a garden. And a house with a garden is what I have available." He held her gaze steadily. "You can throw me out of it whenever you want. The deed will be in your name." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're serious?" she said. "Yes." She looked at Nora again. She was quiet for a moment. Doing the calculation, she always did careful. Thorough. The particular calculation of a woman who had learned not to take things at face value. "I'll look at it," she said, "before I decide." "That's fair," he said. They moved to the house 4 days later. Took that long because Nora needed to be properly discharged from the hospital system. There were forms. There was a pediatrician. There was the entire administrative machinery of bringing a new person into the official record of the world. Elena handled most of it herself, because handling things herself was a 3-year-old muscle that didn't switch off easily, and Damien let her handle them and was available when she needed something, and didn't position himself in the spaces where she wasn't asking for him. He stayed at the safe house the first 2 nights. Renzo found him a hotel for the third, near Holt's office, where the cooperation documentation process was ongoing and required his presence in 2-hour blocks that were exhausting in a different way than anything else in his life had been, exhausting the exhaustion of sitting across from federal attorneys, and dismantling the architecture of 20 years with methodical and complete honesty, without omission, without the careful, partial truths he'd been deploying in rooms his whole professional life. It was the hardest thing he had done. It was also, he understood, the necessary thing not necessary in the practical sense, though it was that too, but necessary, in the way that some things are necessary for a person to be able to look at themselves without the particular brand of disgust that comes from knowing you took a half measure when the full measure was what was required. Carver Holt watched him do it with the expression of a man who has seen many clients in this chair and is revising something about this one. The house was 40 minutes from the city. It was not large 4 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window over the sink that looked into the garden, a living room with enough light in the afternoon to make the room feel like something other than a place you waited in. The garden was overgrown, which was the condition of gardens when no one has been tending them, but the structure of it was their beds, paths, a tree in the back corner that was old enough to have seen a few previous lives from where it stood. Elena walked through it the first time without speaking. She went from room to room with Nora in the carrier against her chest, touching door frames and window ledges with her fingertips, doing the particular assessment that people do when they are deciding whether they can be safe inside something. Damien walked behind her and let her do it. In the back bedroom, the one with the window that looked over the garden, she stopped and stood for a long time. The room was empty, and the light in it was the late afternoon kind, low and warm, and it fell across the floor in a way that made the room look like something from a photograph of a life someone was still in the process of building. "This is her room," Elena said. "Yes," he said. She turned and looked at him, and on her face was the expression he'd seen in the delivery room, the open one, the one without armor, and she let it be there for a moment, before she said, "Thank you." He nodded. He didn't say "you're welcome," because the gratitude was for something he owed her many times over, and welcome implied it had been a gift rather than a debt, and he understood the difference now. The months after that were not simple. He had not expected them to be. He had not told himself a story in which Elena forgave him cleanly, and they moved into the house together, and the damage of 3 years was absorbed by the fact of Nora and the good intentions of the present. He had understood from the night in the hospital when she'd said not tonight to everything he'd wanted to say. He had understood that the work of it was going to be slow and incremental and conducted at her pace, not his. He lived 20 minutes from the house. He came when she asked him to, and didn't come when she didn't, and found that the discipline of that of not positioning himself where he wanted to be, but only where he was wanted, was harder than almost anything else the year required of him. He was there for Nora's first-month checkup. He was there when Nora first smiled at something at Elena's face, specifically at 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, and Elena said his name across the room so he would look, and he looked, and the smile was already gone. But Elena's face, when she said his name, had something in it that was different from the carefully maintained distance of the preceding weeks. He was there for the night Nora wouldn't sleep, 3 months in, and Elena called him at 2 a.m. with the specific flatness of a person who has been awake for 5 hours and has run out of pride. He drove over and walked Nora around the kitchen for 2 hours, while Elena slept on the couch with her arm over her eyes. And when Nora finally went down, he covered Elena with a blanket from the back of the couch and sat in the chair across from her and didn't sleep, just sat there in the quiet of the house and listened to the two of them breathing. He was there the morning Elena found the stack of photographs she'd been keeping in a box from her years of moving photographs from before, from the house they'd shared, from the early years, when they were still the people they'd been, before fear and power and betrayal had done their work on both of them. She sat at the kitchen table with them spread out in front of her, and she didn't say anything for a long time, and Damien sat across from her and waited. "We were happy," she said finally. It wasn't a question and it wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, offered carefully, the way you offer something you're not sure the other person can handle, but need to say anyway. "We were," he said. "I didn't make it up." "No," he said. "You didn't." She looked at the photographs. Her fingers moved to the edge of one of them, a photograph from a trip they'd taken early, before any of it, when he had still been capable of the particular openness that happiness requires, and hadn't yet learned to shut it down, and she touched the corner of it and looked at it for a while. I don't know what we are now, she said. I don't know what I want us to be. That's okay, he said. She looked at him. You're very calm about that. I have things I want, he said. But I've spent the last several months understanding that what I want is not the organizing principle of this situation. What you want, and what's right for Nora, that's what matters. He paused. I can tell you what I want when you're ready to hear it. I'm not in a hurry. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked back at the photographs. Tell me now, she said. I'm not making any decisions. I just tell me. He looked at her hands on the photographs, at the familiar shape of them, at the 3 years that had done things to the rest of her that were not all bad made her harder, in ways that were actually strength, cleaner in her self-knowledge, less willing to accept things because they came from someone certain. I want to be in the room, he said, when Nora laughs, when she's sick, when she asks questions we don't know how to answer. He paused. And I want to be in the room with you. Not because of Nora, in addition to Nora. I want to be in a room with you and have it be the right place for both of us, not a negotiated arrangement. He looked at her directly. I know that's not today. I know you're not there. I'm not asking you to be there. I'm just telling you that's what I want because you asked. Elena looked at the photographs for a long moment. Then she looked up at him, and the expression on her face was the most complicated thing he had seen in a year of complicated expressions. Something that was not forgiveness exactly, because forgiveness wasn't a single moment but a direction, and she was facing the right direction, which was what mattered, which was enough for now. You should stay for dinner, she said. It was not a declaration. It was not the resolution of everything between them. It was an invitation to a meal in a kitchen, offered by a woman who was deciding incrementally and without performance what she was going to let back into her life. Okay, he said. Months later, in the slow, particular way that months accrue when you are paying attention to them, Damien stood in the garden of the house, watching Elena walk the path between the beds with Nora on her hip. The garden was not overgrown anymore. Elena had worked on it through the spring. She said she'd done, for reasons of practical futility, to have something to do with her hands during Nora's nap times, but which had produced, over the months, a garden that was genuinely tended, that had things growing in it, that had been planted with the intention of being there next season and the season after that. Nora was 8 months old and had opinions about everything. She was looking at the tree in the back corner with the specific focus of a person encountering something interesting for approximately the 400th time, and finding it still interesting, which was either evidence of a short memory or evidence of a deep capacity for absorption, and Damien suspected both. He watched Elena point something out to Nora, a bird in the tree, maybe, or something in the bed along the fence, and watched Nora's face track toward it, with that total, uncomplicated attention. Elena looked back over her shoulder and saw him watching, and she looked at him for a moment in a way that was neither guarded nor unguarded, but was simply direct the way she looked at things she'd decided were hers to look at, that she didn't need to manage or perform around. She turned and came back up the path. Nora reached for him when they got close, the particular imperious reach of a baby who has decided she wants to be with a different person and is not interested in any argument about it. He took her, and she grabbed a fistful of his collar and investigated it with complete seriousness. And he stood with her weight against his chest and felt the specific gravity of it, 8 months old, and already the thing in his life that made everything else make sense in a way it hadn't before. She wants to look at the tree up close, Elena said. Then we'll go look at the tree. They walked down the path together, the three of them, in the particular quiet of an afternoon that had nothing demanding it, no urgency, nothing required except this. Damien carried Nora and Elena walked beside him, and when his hand found hers at the bottom of the path, she didn't pull away, she held it, briefly and without ceremony, the way you hold something that has been yours for a long time, and that you have decided, carefully and with full understanding of the cost, to keep. He didn't say anything about it. Neither did she. The tree was old and solid, and entirely indifferent to the small family examining it from below, and Nora studied it with the focused intensity of someone building a complete picture, one detail at a time. That was enough. That was, Damien understood, exactly the right amount, not everything repaired, not everything forgotten, not the easy version of any of it, but real, and present, and held with both hands by people who had learned, the hard way, that what you refuse to let go of is what you get to keep. Promise he had made in a kitchen years ago over bad coffee, had been broken and buried and dug up and examined. And finally, in the slow way that real things happen, honored not in the original terms, which had been made by a man who didn't yet understand what honoring anything truly cost, but in the revised and honest terms of a man who did. Stayed. That was the whole of it. He stayed, and the staying was not simple or painless or without its ongoing cost, and it was also, without question, the truest thing he had ever done.